Thank you very much. Yes, I'm Ray Keating, Chief Economist with the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Council. SBE Council is a nonpartisan, nonprofit advocacy, research, and education organization that works to protect small business and promote entrepreneurship. With regard to NAFTA negotiations, it's critical that all parties stay true to free trade goals and principles of reducing government barriers, obstacles, and costs that limit opportunities for entrepreneurs, businesses, workers, and consumers. The U.S. has, in fact, benefited tremendously from NAFTA. Consider that Canada is the top trade partner in terms of total trade with the U.S., including ranking as the top U.S. export market, and Mexico is number 3, including being the second largest U.S. export market. Since free trade accords went into effect with Canada, Mexico, and the U.S., export growth from the U.S. to both nations has been quite strong, but particularly strong to Mexico. Since NAFTA took effect, U.S. goods exports to Mexico have grown by 452% from 1993 to 2016. That was more than double the growth in U.S. exports to the world. And it is important to keep in mind that NAFTA has been very good news for small businesses. Trade with Canada and Mexico is overwhelmingly populated by smaller businesses. On the export front, for example, when we look at Canada, 60% of exporters to Canada have less than 20 employees, 84% have less than 100 employees. When you look at Mexico, 58% of U.S. exporters have less than 20 workers, and 82% have less than 100 workers. Also, the growth in the number of U.S. firms exporting to both Canada and Mexico has been dramatic. From 1992 to 2015, there was an 81% increase in the number of U.S. exporters to Canada and a rather dramatic 366% increase in those exporting to Mexico. It's important to recognize imports as well. After all, U.S. consumers and businesses benefit from the expanded choices and lower costs that come with low barriers to imports. And it's important to keep in mind that imports are not negatives to the U.S. economy, but instead fundamentally are a reflection of the state of the domestic economy. For example, strong domestic economic growth naturally generates growth in imports. In addition, many U.S. firms obviously are involved in the importation of goods. Again, the vast majority here are small and medium-sized businesses. A quick example, when you look at U.S. importers, 57% of companies that import goods from Mexico have less than 20 workers, 74% less than 100. And on the Canadian side, 42% have less than 20 workers and 64% less than 100 workers. Negotiations going forward must be built on the tremendous success of NAFTA, that is, burdens or costs on individuals and businesses. Trading among the three nations should not be increased, but instead, this should be treated as an opportunity for further reducing such obstacles. International trade, that is, businesses and individuals trading across borders, provides, by definition, mutual benefits. NAFTA's lowering of trade barriers between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico works in each nation's favor. Further lowering those barriers would be good news for U.S. economic, income, and employment growth. Thank you very much.
Our next witness is Rufus Zersa, President of the National Foreign Trade Council. Mr. Zersa, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for giving us this opportunity to testify. I'm here on behalf of the National Foreign Trade Council, which is an association dedicated to making American companies more competitive in the global economy by ensuring adoption of forward-looking tax and trade policies, by strengthening global rules, and by opening foreign markets to U.S. products. Our companies cover really the breadth of the national economy, virtually all sectors, accounting for more than $3 trillion in total sales worldwide and employing over 5 million Americans and producing a large share of our nation's total exports. And the success of our companies in world markets would not have been possible without the hard work and talent of those in the U.S. government who have been able to negotiate better trading conditions worldwide for our goods and services. And nowhere has that been more apparent than in our trade with Canada and Mexico. $600 billion now annually in exports to these two markets. And although our exporters do face some continued problems in these markets, which I'll talk about, NAFTA has succeeded in eliminating a large part of the barriers U.S. exports to these markets have increased 350% in real terms since the agreement went into effect, and it has contributed significantly to the bottom line of our companies. But the gains from NAFTA go beyond just the gains of exports to those two markets. I want to emphasize the increasing importance of the North American integrated production platform to the ability of our companies to compete effectively with producers in Asia, Europe, and other regions. In the auto sector, for example, the integration of the North American production has lifted our export competitiveness, increasing U.S. exports of autos to over 2 million vehicles annually, which is more than 5 times the volume of exports prior to NAFTA. There are a number of other examples. I want to emphasize what we submitted to you in our written submission as you begin this process of considering what U.S. position should be in renegotiating. We depend heavily on a smooth functioning open market among the 3 NAFTA countries. Any efforts to modernize NAFTA must recognize this reality. Well, it's important to address remaining barriers, especially those affecting newer technologies and modes of transport that didn't exist when NAFTA was enacted. We already enjoy significant gains, as I said earlier, from the existing agreement, and any final agreement that diminishes that access will have significant adverse effects on our operations, sales, and employment. So we believe there are many ways the agreement can be improved to expand access and strengthen rules, and we're prepared to work closely with you to identify those. Let me mention the sort of 5 key guiding principles we outlined in our submission. The first, as I already said, create more open markets and better rules, not new restrictions. Number 2, strengthen the North American production platform. Third, it should remain a tripartite agreement. And fourth, it should reflect the changes in the world economy, particularly the digital economy and e-commerce and other new technologies that didn't exist when NAFTA was originally negotiated. And finally, update the rules in other more traditional areas of trade that need to be looked at after 20 years of this agreement. I want to emphasize a couple of specific objectives and issues that we put on the table in our submission to you in various areas. In the customs and trade facilitation area, we emphasize streamlining and making more transparent customs clearance procedures to ensure that the movement of goods across the border is more efficient. Establish a commercially meaningful de minimis threshold in Canada and Mexico for small packages and other deliveries. A better framework of rules for digital trade, including restrictions on data localization requirements and those kinds of restrictions. Maintaining the rules of origin of the original agreement, addressing intellectual property issues, particularly Canada's patent utility standard known as the Promise Doctrine, which is inconsistent with international practice, and also updating to the current NAFTA to include a 12-year period of regulatory data protection for biologic medicines, and establishing criminal procedures and penalties for trade secret theft. In the investment area, the investment chapter should be revised and updated, in particular to apply to state-owned enterprises, and should not contain any industry-specific carve-outs. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I look forward to the question and answers.
The next witness is Brandon Arnold, Executive Vice President with the National Taxpayers Union. Mr. Arnold, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody. It is quite the pleasure to be here today to testify on behalf of National Taxpayers Union. If you're not familiar with NTU, we are the nation's oldest taxpayer group. We advocate at all levels of government for lower taxes, limited government, and free market principles. I'm here today because I believe there have been a number of interests that have been well represented before the panel, business community, the labor community, and these are all extraordinarily important perspectives as we try to understand the full breadth of this debate over NAFTA. But I think one of the least represented views here in Washington generally when it comes to trade is the average taxpayer, the average consumer. And I think in many ways these are the folks that are going to be most significantly affected by our trade policies. NAFTA has fundamentally been a positive force for the living standard of the average American. And we do have serious concerns as we renegotiate this agreement that any kind of significant tariff increase, any non-tariff barrier to trade could have an adverse impact on the average taxpayer. In fact, there's been research I'm sure you're well familiar with that suggests that something in the order of 35% tariff on Mexican imports could cost the average American family somewhere in the neighborhood of $2,000, $2,200. This is some serious cash when you're talking about lower or middle income American family. It would require these people to make very, very difficult, sometimes painful decisions as they try to provide for their families. So I will be brief in my remarks. I'll basically sum up there. But we do have very, very serious concerns about the impacts of protectionist policies that could emanate from these NAFTA renegotiations on average taxpayers. I encourage the USTR, the administration broadly, to have a very, very keen focus on the impacts of trade policy on the average taxpayer and the average family as they undertake this very important task.
The next witness is Kyle Eisenhower, Vice President for Regulatory and Economic Policy with the American Petroleum Institute. Mr. Eisenhower, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Members of the Trade Policy Staff Committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. My name is Kyle Eisenhower. I'm Vice President.
Pull your mic a little closer, please.
Okay. I'm Vice President, Regulatory and Economic Policy at the American Petroleum Institute. API is the only national trade association representing all facets of the oil and natural gas industry. Today's North American energy market, including oil and natural gas, is highly integrated and interdependent, which has been facilitated by the North American Free Trade Agreement. A critical component of the North American energy market is the U.S. energy renaissance. The United States is now the largest producer of oil and natural gas in the world. According to the EIA, the U.S. is projected to surpass the historical 1970 peak of crude oil production by 2018. And since 2005, natural gas production in the U.S. has increased by 47%. Energy flows between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico are multi-directional and depicted in the graphic from the API North American Energy Backgrounder, which I hope is distributed to you, but if not, I have extra copies. Canada is the top export market for U.S. crude oil, motor gasoline blending components, and kerosene-type jet fuel. Mexico is the largest export market for U.S. pipeline natural gas, total refined products, finished motor gasoline, and distillate fuel oil. In addition, significant U.S. crude imports from Mexico are manufactured in the U.S. into the refined products that are exported back to Mexico and elsewhere. As for natural gas, in 2016, the United States exported 2.1 trillion cubic feet of natural gas by pipeline to Canada and Mexico. U.S. pipeline capacity for natural gas exports to Mexico has rapidly expanded in the past few years and is expected to nearly double in the next 3 years. Mexico is also a new market for U.S. LNG, receiving 67 billion cubic feet of natural gas shipped since February 2016. U.S. refineries also receive crude oil from Canada and Mexico, which supports U.S. jobs. In 2016, 69 U.S. refineries, primarily in the Midwest, processed heavy sour crude oil from Canada. In 2016, 12 U.S. refineries along the Gulf Coast imported crude oil from Mexico, producing refined products for both U.S. and Mexican markets. Since 2000, Mexico's net imports of gasoline and diesel have tripled, most of which are supplied by refineries in the United States. Canada and Mexico are also significant markets for U.S. investment in oil and natural gas. Mexico's hydrocarbon sector is just now opening to foreign investment for the first time in nearly a century. In Mexico's December 2016 bid round of deepwater blocks, U.S. companies were successful in capturing 5 of the 8 blocks awarded. As the President, USTR, and Congress begin to consider possible changes to the NAFTA, we urge them to keep in mind the important role this agreement has played in fostering the dynamic energy relationship between our countries. As an energy superpower, with the United States as the world's leading producer of oil and natural gas, NAFTA has allowed U.S. oil, natural gas, and derived products to flow to and from both Canada and Mexico. API urges the U.S. government to retain the following in a modernized NAFTA. First, zero tariffs. NAFTA eliminated tariffs for crude oil, gasoline, motor fuel blending stock, distillate fuel oil, and kerosene-type jet fuel. Second, full trade liberalization. NAFTA also liberalizes trade in energy, including the automatic liberalization per the Natural Gas Act of U.S. natural gas exports to Canada and Mexico. Third, market access that is non-discriminatory, providing national treatment to U.S. products and investors. NAFTA also plays a critical role for U.S. foreign direct investment in Canada and Mexico. And fourth, investment protection. NAFTA's provisions for strong investment protections, which are consistent with U.S. law, are essential for U.S. oil and natural gas investments in Canada and Mexico. In conclusion, NAFTA supports U.S. jobs in manufacturing and energy, helps to make energy more affordable for American families, enhances energy security and affordable energy for U.S. allies, and enables U.S. companies to compete in Canada and gain opportunities for development in Mexico. We look forward to working with the administration and Congress to continue the U.S. energy renaissance and our energy linkages to North America and the rest of the world. Thank you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
The next witness is John Murphy, Senior Vice President for International Policy with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Mr. Murphy, you have 5 minutes.
I'd like to thank the officials here today for their patience and attention during this week's hearing. We've reached the moment when everything has been said, but not quite everyone has said it, with apologies to Mr. Aldonis. I appear here today representing the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the nation's largest business organization. We directly represent hundreds of thousands of companies of every size, every state, every sector, manufacturing, agriculture, services. Indirectly, we represent the interests of 3 million companies through our nationwide federation of thousands of state and local chambers of commerce and sector associations. This year's debate over the NAFTA, with its ups and downs, has cast the views of the U.S. business and agriculture communities toward the agreement in stark relief. In my 2 years working at the Chamber on trade, I've seen nothing like it. And here's the bottom line. Many, many American companies depend on the NAFTA every day. Support for the agreement among those who actually manufacture, provide services, and run farms and ranches, I believe, runs much broader and deeper than commonly thought, and perhaps more so than a hearing of this nature will necessarily draw out. While modernization of the agreement is a reasonable and worthy goal, many companies approach today's discussion with trepidation. They're nervous lest this process endanger the market access and rules they benefit from under the agreement. For other companies, the Canadian and Mexican markets are incredibly important, even though these firms may not directly benefit or rely on NAFTA rules. For them, however, withdrawing from or limiting the NAFTA would harm the Canadian and Mexican economies, and that would harm these American companies and the workers they employ in turn. For some sectors, this year's debate has also exposed benefits from the NAFTA that even the companies themselves had not fully appreciated. Take the oil and gas sector, as we've just heard. Many companies have recognized just how much they've benefited from under the NAFTA. You know the song, "Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you got till it's gone?" So the Chamber asks the administration and Congress to proceed with these realities clear in mind. Let us do no harm. Let us build on the market access and rules we currently enjoy under the NAFTA. And to quote House Ways and Means Committee Chairman Kevin Brady, let us proceed in a manner that retains current benefits in a seamless way that does not disrupt the current agreement. Let's consider how to best use the NAFTA's amendment process and continue on the path that the administration, to its credit, has set forth on in its notification to Congress, hewing to the course laid out in the TPA law of 2015. Of course, the NAFTA can be improved. We look forward to working toward that goal. And in our written comments, we've laid out some detailed recommendations on the digital economy, intellectual property, SBS and TBT issues, customs, competition, good regulatory practices, and so on. We further urge the administration not to pursue rash calls to abandon NAFTA provisions that have brought real benefits for Americans. These include the agreement's rules on investment and procurement. Many Americans benefit from these rules, and there's little evidence that they've ever harmed anyone. We also urge you to study seriously the evidence that tightening the NAFTA's rules of origin, which are already quite stringent, could backfire, could actually reduce North American content. In conclusion, we respectfully ask that the U.S. negotiators bear in mind that approximately 14 million American jobs depend on trade with Canada and Mexico. Assuredly, the NAFTA can be modernized in ways that do not put these jobs at risk, but rather expands them into new areas and for new parts of America's 21st century economy. This goal is eminently achievable, and the Chamber looks forward to working with you to achieve it. Thank you.
Our final witness on this panel, as well as these 3 days of hearings, is Grin Aldonis, Commissioner with the Legatum Institute. Mr. Aldonis, you have 5 minutes.
First of all, thank you to the panel. Thanks for the opportunity, and thank you for your endurance in terms of getting through these 3 days. As you know, it's incredibly important to the process, and there's actually nothing more important going on in the United States government than what you guys are doing with respect to the modernization of NAFTA. So I thought what I would do, rather than going with the remarks I'd prepared, was actually take up the challenge that John laid out and say something unique and different, which, for those of you who know me, isn't going to be that difficult, to be honest with you. Here's the point, which is that you can take all the specific items that are going to be the conventional trade barriers, the things we should maintain. I would associate myself with John's remarks, remarks of the panel, certainly Rufus's remarks. But what I would say is the 2018 trade policy agenda actually identified a legitimate concern, and modernization of NAFTA is the place to tackle that. What it laid out was the fact that there's a series of unwritten assumptions that underpin the trading system. There are assumptions about property rights, enforceability of contracts, the idea that competition should be unfettered and take place between profit-maximizing firms that aren't privileged in any way and, frankly, are not protected from the pressure of capital markets in any way. And getting to that conclusion is going to require you to actually turn those unwritten assumptions into legal text, into legal commitments. And the way to do that, honestly, is to be focusing beyond the border at what we at the Legatum Institute have identified as anti-competitive market distorting measures, which is an ungainly term for those things that offer a privilege that isn't enjoyed by everybody, that raises the uncertainty or the opacity in a market, which is more difficult for the outside firm to enter in, the enforceability of contracts, the efficiency of the legal system, but frankly, it's fleshing out those unwritten assumptions. And the reason I would suggest that, and a very ambitious outcome to what you guys try and do, is that tinkering around the edges is going to you'll end up with an agreement where the juice isn't worth the squeeze. This actually is an opportunity to take a very large step forward as you modernize this, to define what modernizing the trade agreement would be, not just for NAFTA, but how you reach beyond that. And in closing, I'll just add one thing, which is I would think hard, not just about the 3 partners. With all due deference to what Rufus said, it should be a tripartite agreement as you negotiate it, but I would be thinking about the model you're building for the rest of the trading system. And in doing that, I would think about the conditions that you would apply to what right now is a very open-ended accession agreement. I would identify explicitly what the expectations are for the countries that would qualify for accession in terms of these unwritten assumptions about participating in trade with the United States, Mexico, and Canada. And I would say objectively, the one country that would easily satisfy those standards is the United Kingdom. And I'd be thinking hard about offering an observer status to signal to the rest of the trade community around the world that this is not going to stop here in terms of the effort that you guys will invest in modernizing the trade regime, and that the United States intends to lead it.
Mr. Chairman, that concludes direct testimony from this panel.
Well, we are energized with some questions for our last panel today. We're not going to let you go early too much. Let me turn to Mitch Ferguson with the State Department to ask our first question.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Keating, in your comments, you note that NAFTA has been good news for small and medium-sized enterprises, and that one of your key principles is that the burdens and costs of doing business for SMEs should not be increased under a modernized NAFTA. What provisions should we focus on in a renegotiation to ensure that U.S. SMEs continue to benefit or expand under NAFTA? Maybe it's a prioritization question.
I guess I'll answer that two ways, too quickly. Number one is, I think clarifying the purpose here is critical. I mean, I know, quite frankly, I do this for a living. I'm an economist. I'm not fully clear as to why we're doing this. So I think that needs to be made clear to the business community in general, to small businesses and entrepreneurs that are looking at, they're going global. Telecommunications is, we all know the story. So I think they need a clear message here that what we're trying to do here is what we're arguing we hopefully are doing it, that we're going to reduce barriers and make it easier, and it's not going to become more difficult. So I think that's number one. Number two then, and this is going forward, we want to explore this more. We do a lot of work in intellectual property. So we want to see is everything in this agreement up to speed with where we need to be in terms of protecting intellectual property for entrepreneurs and small businesses and for everybody else, quite frankly. And then, of course, as others have mentioned, the digital economy, what's around today that wasn't around then, right? So we want to work on those things and get greater clarity. But I think, we always hear about businesses hate uncertainty. Well, they do hate uncertainty. And the more certainty we can get into this as to what the objectives are, that would be great. And quite frankly, the quicker we move to get it done and off the table would be good news for business as well.
If I could address a question to Rufus Yerxa, but welcome comments from others. What we've heard over the last 3 days, a lot of themes stick out. One of them is do no harm or do it in a seamless way or preserve all the benefits. The other is this is going to be a model for whatever comes next, at least in U.S. trade policy and whether U.S. trade policy. Hopefully, the world pays attention to that. And then a third common comment is do it fast. And there's a little tension between those three objectives. Maybe I'll ask an old NAFTA negotiator for some advice on that.
Well, first I want to wish you luck in all of it. Obviously those are not always entirely reconcilable goals, and especially the doing it fast, because as has been apparent in this panel and others, the closer you get to the negotiating table, the more issues you're going to be seeing coming up on all sides, and you haven't even begun to deal yet with whatever list Canada will have or Mexico will have. And so, I have a lot of sympathy for the effort to try to find a coherent way forward that is going to actually make forward progress in the agreement and also be fast. I think, the most important part here is to get it right and to make sure that you end up with an agreement that moves the opportunities for business and for economic growth in all three countries forward, doesn't begin to build in kind of new ways of managing or restricting trade. Just going back to the comments about digital economy and the importance of this agreement in updating the NAFTA to take account of this enormous revolution in the world economy that's occurred since we negotiated the original agreement. The democratization of trade because of the kinds of things now available in the platform for a digital economy that enable small businesses and medium-sized businesses that were never part of the trading system to export it. eBay is a member of my association. 90% of the people who advertise on eBay have some percentage of their sales in exports. And a lot of that is in Canada and Mexico. That's why we emphasize things like getting these de minimis requirements up and doing other things with rules on digital trade to enable those elements of the platform. And if you think about it from the standpoint of the bigger businesses in the U.S. that I represent, what area of the world economy is the U.S. more competitive and dominant in than all of the elements of this platform for digital trade and for small and medium-sized businesses to become part of the world economy. We have the top express delivery companies. We have the top companies that have the internet elements of that equation. We have the top companies in the financial sector for the payment systems and everything else. And both the U.S. will profit greatly from that, and as will Canada and Mexico. And by the way, they were willing to sign on to all of this as part of TPP, so I do see that as helping in your objective of doing this quickly.
Thank you. Can I turn to Peter Meyer for a question?
Thank you. My question's for Mr. Arnold. In your testimony, you stressed that trade agreements like NAFTA promote economic efficiency through lowering consumer prices and increasing employment in specialized industries. One of your recommendations has to do with maintaining reasonable rules of origin. What, in your view, are the factors the U.S. government should take into account when take into consideration when determining whether any given approaches to rules of origin is reasonable?
Sure. Well, I think rules of origin are meant to facilitate trade, not to hinder it. So I think as we've re-examined them, I think some of the rhetoric surrounding how we should revisit rules of origin have actually had kind of a protectionist tinge in their inclination, and I think that's unfortunate. I think we need to be very cognizant of the fact that many people who seek to take advantage, many smaller manufacturers and businesses that are seeking to take advantage of the lower tariffs and the other provisions of NAFTA simply do not have the economies of scale some of the larger companies that are here in the United States, and we need to have as streamlined and simplified a process as we possibly can so they can fully benefit from NAFTA's provisions.
I'll ask John Anderson to pose a question.
Thank you, John, and thank you all for your testimony. My question to you, Mr. Murphy, is a little bit of a similar to what Mr. Melly asked of Mr. Yerxa. The Chamber also talks about the need to move quickly and also to eliminate uncertainty and also to ensure a seamless transition. With regard to ensuring a seamless transition, what would be the greatest challenges for Canada and Mexico to negotiate and implement a new trade agreement, and will these challenges add to the uncertainty for your members?
It's a difficult question to answer because we've heard a lot less about what the Canadians and Mexicans might be looking for, and if anything, hearing from them more clearly will perhaps facilitate this, because at the moment you've been listening to 3 days of requests and demands from the U.S. business and agriculture communities, and where are the typical trade-offs that are the coin of the realm in a trade negotiation. That is yet to be seen. And I recall in the TPP, the Canadians only had a handful of things, for instance, in the area of procurement that they were looking for. So hopefully hearing more from them will illuminate the path forward a little bit more. But we wish you the best of luck in solving this iron triangle here of move fast, get a lot, don't mess anything up, and look forward to trying to have an ongoing dialogue with you in the months ahead about how to figure that out.
And starting it in high vacation season, I think, is the best way to do that. Let me ask Ed Gresser to try and top Grant Aldonis's challenge to us with a pithy question back to him.
Okay. Pithy question. You mentioned an accession clause. You mentioned United Kingdom. They are in the midst of negotiations with the European Union, whose terms we don't know. Can you say generally what's the benefit of adding new countries to this, to the NAFTA?
The most important thing, Ed, is what it signals in terms of the direction that U.S. trade policy is going to take going forward, and that the process won't end with the modernization of NAFTA. That the core, the approach you want to adopt, which is really looking beyond the ostensible and really examining where transaction costs impede small firms reaching other markets through eBay, is really the right approach, and it's an approach we really should be following in the context of the WTO. It actually would reach beyond what was a part of a very good agreement in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But I think that's the key going forward, because the firmament underneath us has changed technologically, how industrial organization takes place. We need to signal that we're not going to stop with NAFTA, but we're going to actually take that seriously going forward, and that every step we take trade policy-wise is going to acknowledge the reality that we face, but also force other countries to acknowledge that reality as well. Could I just say, John, too, you know what? The right answer to the question you asked Rufus and John is the Spike Lee movie, Do the Right Thing, right? I mean, no good agreement is going to be done under a tight time frame because of the ambition you have to have. And politically, thinking this all the way through to the end, the implementation, if you want an agreement that's going to pass the Congress, it is going to have a scale that draws support to it. That requires thinking big. That is not an agreement that gets done on a short time frame.
Appreciate that advice. But we're going to finish this hearing on schedule. Rufus, did you want to add to the colloquy?
I wanted to comment on Grant's last point because I very much agree with him that you're going to have a significant challenge in getting momentum behind any new agreement, which all of us who've been involved in these kinds of efforts know is something that takes time to take shape, and you've got to have something that's got a lot on the table and ultimately a lot that all three countries can sign on to. It's kind of hard to see how win-lose deals can ever be successful. So I think that getting it right doesn't necessarily mean getting it done on any specific timetable. I mean, as negotiators, you always want to set the timetable because that will push decision-making. But we are in a new dynamic and shifting gears from what the trade policy priorities of the past have been to getting a good NAFTA deal that can become a model that others might want to accede to. My question is, will others want to accede to it if it's not the right kind of deal? I don't disagree with Grant that would be a great goal to achieve. I can think of a bunch of countries in Asia that we could see might be interested in acceding. So I think it is important to build that momentum by getting the right kinds of U.S. objectives through this consultation, your process you're doing now. And I greatly admire you all for the patience and fortitude of going through all these hearings. I think it is important to building the base of understanding. I realize we're close to the holidays. You've been very patient and listened to a lot of people. And as the old saying goes, the mind cannot absorb what the seat cannot endure. So whenever you want to adjourn is fine with me.
Let's do one more question. Mitch?
Thank you, John. On energy, Mr. Eisenhower, you pointed out that significant energy sector reform is underway in Mexico.
Correct.
What specific rules and market access commitments would API prioritize in the NAFTA renegotiation to fully capture the benefits of Mexico's energy reform, maybe consolidate them? What would you prioritize?
Well, certainly investor protections would be essential. We've seen what happened in a situation in Venezuela not too long ago, where U.S. assets were seized, and having the ISDS process in place to ensure that, not that I would expect Canada or Mexico to take the steps that Venezuela did, but to ensure that there are disputes there and incentivize the investment in Canada and Mexico certainly would be a huge step, and making sure that we have that continued is a huge step. The Mexican energy market is opening, and we already won actually the last bid round that I mentioned in my testimony. 5 of the 8 blocks were won in the deep water Mexican Gulf of Mexico were won by U.S. firms. So there really is an opportunity there, and that opportunity is going to continue to grow. In fact, we see that any technology-driven development, such as hydraulic fracturing or deep water, really is enhanced by having the technological know-how that the U.S. companies have. So there's a real opportunity, not only if we are successful, and we anticipate we will be successful in some of the deep water projects, but also to move on to hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling projects in Mexico as well. So there's a real opportunity there. But again, the existing provisions in NAFTA that make that attractive have to remain in place for that to be a viable alternative.
Mr. Ferguson, if I could add to that, so my first tour in the Foreign Service was in Mexico in the days of Lopez Portillo. Where we are right now on energy is unimaginable in Mexico. But the key in the context of NAFTA is that provision which locks in regulatory changes of this sort, that needs to actually be reinforced so there's no backsliding. And the really important thing is what Kyle was pointing to about what comes next in terms of fracking and all the other technologies that can be applied. What you want to do, and this would be true of the market generally, I would say, true what you want to accomplish in NAFTA, but in energy, you want to favor the innovators over the incumbents. Our incumbents, their incumbents. The aim has to be that. That's our energy future, right? And I think that is actually a good operating rule for the entire agreement.
I'm sorry. Okay. Just really quick on the Mexico thing. When you go by that statue of the petroleros that's right there, you know how far we've come in Mexico. Just the brief question is, with those deep water blocks, was there a requirement for Pemex partnership of a certain percentage, or was it just straight up winning?
There are partnership agreements. There is a requirement for partnership. Off the top of my head, I don't require what their percentage was, but there is a partnership for those blocks.
Yeah, just a data question for Mr. Arnold. You mentioned some estimates of effects of tariffs imposition on families. Do you have any thoughts about, or are there estimates of the effects of NAFTA and its reduction of barriers over these 24 years on American families?
Off the top of my head, I don't actually have any of that data, I'm sorry to say. But our understanding would be that certainly reduction in non-tariff barriers as well has been a benefit to American families and households.
All right, I'm going to blame this last panel for drawing out additional questions from us, not because of your experience or breadth of jobs and responsibilities you've had. So this is the end of this panel and of these hearings. And again, I want to thank you for your participation, for your written comments, for making the trip here today to provide oral comments and engage with us. This, as some of you said, this is an important part of our process of determining exactly what it is we're going to do as we renegotiate the NAFTA, and to do it in the best way that we can. Appreciate that. I'm sure we'll continue to seek your advice and others' advice as we go forward. So thank you very much. I also want to thank the U.S. International Trade Commission for all the support they've provided to us throughout. Bill Bishop, my staff at USTR that have been here throughout, or if not here, back at the ranch writing up questions, so we have enough for the next panel coming on board. And I don't know if any of our audience members have been here for all 3 days. A show of hands. Come on. What? Huh? All right. Well, you get a special prize as well. Hope you found it as valuable as we have. So again, thanks to everyone for their participation, and that concludes this NAFTA hearing.
Thank you for this opportunity to testify on behalf of an important consumer health issue in Canada. My name is Carolyn Herman, and I am the Deputy General Counsel of the Consumer Healthcare Products Association. For more than 136 years,
Pull your mic a little closer for me, please.
CHPA has represented the leading manufacturers and marketers of over-the-counter medicines and dietary supplements. CHPA members provide millions of Americans with safe, effective, and affordable therapies to treat and prevent many common ailments and diseases. I appear before you today to urge the United States to include in its negotiating objectives for the modernization of NAFTA the incorporation of a key data protection provision that exists in U.S. law but not in Canadian law. I am speaking about the 3-year period of data protection afforded in the United States under the Hatch-Waxman Act to the clinical data required to obtain regulatory approval to switch prescription products to non-prescription status. CHPA and its sister associations in Canada and Mexico took the unusual step of filing a joint submission to request the United States include this issue in its negotiating objectives because we believe the benefits of this policy change are so compelling to all stakeholders in 3 countries. Current Canadian law establishes a period of 8 continuous years of data protection for new chemical entities, but data to support new uses for existing drugs, such as that required for prescription to over-the-counter switches, does not benefit from any form of protection. Furthermore, because Canada's system for switches is ingredient-based instead of product-based as in the United States, it is considered a technical regulation under the WTO's TBT agreement. That triggers a mandatory notification and comment period that delays the finalization of the switch for at least 6 months. The combination of this delay and Canada's lack of data protection for switches disincentivizes healthcare companies from investing in the additional research needed to switch products from prescription to over-the-counter status. The lengthy approval process means that competitors often reach the market at essentially the same time as the innovator. Ensuring the same standard of protection as provided in the United States will encourage innovators to actively pursue prescription to over-the-counter switches in Canada, resulting in significant benefits to all stakeholders, including governments, pharmaceutical companies, and consumers. A study by the Conference Board of Canada we attached to our submission shows that the economic value of switching just 3 categories of products would result in $1 billion in savings. These savings come in the form of decreased costs for payers of prescription medicine, such as provincial governments, employers, private drug plan sponsors, and individuals who currently do not have access to prescription drug coverage. Pharmaceutical companies also stand to gain access to a broader over-the-counter market. An analysis of the effect of switching 9 categories found that the use of the drug increased by 30% following the first switch. Most importantly, prescription to over-the-counter switches act as an important policy tool for increasing access to medicines. Over-the-counter medicines are easier, faster, and more convenient to obtain, allowing consumers to take greater control of their healthcare decisions. Greater access to over-the-counter medicines also reduces healthcare costs generally by allowing consumers to self-medicate rather than visit a doctor for routine issues. In short, modernizing NAFTA to provide data protection for prescription to over-the-counter switches in Canada will lower the cost of medicines, lower healthcare costs more generally, increase access to medicines, increase market access for healthcare companies, and bring Canadian intellectual property law up to the standards in the United States. This presents one of those truly rare issues where all stakeholders unambiguously stand to benefit from a policy change. Thank you.
The next witness is Kevin Kaczynski, Vice President of the Detroit International Bridge Company. Mr. Kaczynski, you have 5 minutes.
I'm Kevin Kaczynski, the Vice President at the Detroit International Bridge Company, which is a U.S. family-owned business that owns and operates the Ambassador Bridge that connects Detroit, Michigan with Windsor, Canada. On behalf of DIBC, I want to thank you all for the opportunity to present public comment. It's a big undertaking, I can tell, and we're happy to be here and be able to speak with you. The family that I work for has been trying to build a replacement for the 88-year-old Ambassador Bridge for more than a decade. Our experience in this effort has shown that Canada has not been consistently committed to the free trade principles that are articulated in NAFTA, by this current administration, and by Congress. I want to hone in on 2 of those principles: competition and investment. First, as it relates to competition, Congress has indicated, quote, "The principal negotiating objective of the United States regarding competition by state-owned and state-controlled enterprises is to seek commitments that eliminate or prevent trade distortions and unfair competition favoring state-owned and state-controlled enterprises, and ensure that such engagement is based solely on commercial considerations without market-distorting subsidies." Second, as it relates to investment, Congress has indicated that trade agreements should focus on, quote, "reducing or eliminating exceptions to the principle of national treatment," i.e., the concept that all NAFTA investors are treated equal. We submitted our comment, and I'm here today to provide evidence to the USTR that these concepts, these ideas are occurring today. We are feeling the experience of them as a U.S. private company. We want to suggest that the USTR take these issues up in the negotiation, and we want to provide some suggestions on how to do so. As our written submission shows in detail, we have experienced unfair competition by a Canadian government-owned and subsidized entity that seeks to build a new bridge right next to ours, even though there's no market-based reason to do so. We've also experienced disparate treatment in Canada in our effort to obtain the necessary approvals to build our own bridge. These are behind-the-border barriers that prevent U.S. private investment. To prevent this kind of unfair competition, we offer 4 concrete suggestions. First, in international crossing corridors where there's existing private competitors, NAFTA governments should only be allowed to enter that market where there's an economic justification for doing so. In other words, there should be a market-based reason for government to enter markets with private investors, i.e., a need that's not being met by the market. This suggestion would specifically address Congress's identification of unfair competition caused by state-owned and state-subsidized entities. Second, the negotiation should seek to create a unified, non-discriminatory process for obtaining the regulatory approvals necessary to modify international crossings. The USTR should seek agreement that any new regulations imposed on existing international crossings will be applied equally to all other existing or proposed crossings. This suggestion would further the congressional intent expressed by the principle that all NAFTA investors should be treated equally. Third, the negotiation should seek to obtain commitments to not create structural subsidies for state-owned and state-controlled entities that cannot be independently justified on an economic basis. And finally, the negotiation should seek to preserve and strengthen private enterprises' ability to seek equitable relief when their rights are harmed. These objectives that I've laid out for you are informed both by our understanding of the current administration's concern over certain Canadian trade practices and by our own experience. And I wanted to finally reiterate our request that we made in our written comment that, if appropriate, we would appreciate the opportunity to meet with the USTR or his staff to discuss the issues that we've raised in our comment. Thank you.
Our final witness on this panel is Dan Izzo, representative for the Western Canada Alliance of Wall and Ceiling Contractors. Mr. Izzo, you have 5 minutes.
Well, again, good afternoon. My name is Dan Izzo. I am an international trade and customs attorney with Dickinson Wright, acting on behalf of the Western Canada Alliance of Ceiling and Wall Contractors, here and after the Alliance, or contractors. The Alliance are more than 23 contractors that are large consumers of and customers of U.S. manufactured gypsum, otherwise known as drywall, that operate in the Canadian western provinces of Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia. On behalf of the Alliance, we thank you for the opportunity to appear this afternoon to discuss issues relating to both Section B, the specific issues of the Federal Register notice, product issues, as well as Section P, the dispute resolution mechanism. As a threshold question, why are 23 Canadian contractors here in front of the USTR and other government agencies talking about NAFTA modernization, particularly since it's the peak of the building season? Unfortunately, these issues, they've been caught in a trade dispute.
Dan, is your microphone on?
I don't think it's hot. No.
Can you push the button again, please? There you go.
Thank you. Unfortunately, these trade issues have popped up in both the softwood lumber issues as well as a dispute that has recently been launched by the government of Canada that we suggest has directly impacted issues relating to the dispute resolution negotiations of the NAFTA modernization project. By way of background, while we're not here to relitigate the case, the fact is this time last year, a French-owned company operating in Canada and the United States sought to gain a competitive advantage by bringing a trade case in Canada alleging inter alia anti-dumping or dumping by U.S. companies. The CBSA investigated the matter last summer and imposed 200% duties on U.S. drywall manufacturers doing business in Canada. The overwhelming majority of the Alliance members are on fixed contracts with these drywall manufacturers operating from the United States. Their prices skyrocketed overnight from 0% duties to 200% duties, and the market immediately responded by increasing prices of drywall by 30% overnight, and that has continued at about a 6% clip since last year's building season. Canada, the contractors immediately initiated a public interest review using domestic trade fora in Canada. And fortunately, this Canadian International Trade Tribunal found that the imposition of those duties was against the Canadian public interest. And that was the first time ever that those proceedings had been launched during the pendency of a trade case. As USTR likely knows, that those generally occur after the final imposition of the duties. The proposed remedy was threefold. One, a remission order to collect the duties for the fall of last year, a duty holiday for this building season, January to July.
that would allow those contractors to operate in this season and then adjust those fixed contracts, and then the imposition of a 43% duty on a 5-year basis on a go forward. While the Alliance certainly wasn't happy with duties that went from 0 to 43%, it nevertheless was seen as a way to resolve the dispute. Unfortunately, the government of Canada has not fully implemented that remedy, in particular, the duty holiday. The implications are significant. U.S. exporters of drywall, most of whom have withdrawn from the Canadian market, allowing foreign imports to come in. We are seeing Mexican drywall now enter the Canadian market to replace that demand. I do note that Canada is unable to meet the demand for drywall in the market. Roughly 50% of all drywall sold in Canada comes from the United States, although that number is now slipping as foreign imports are replacing those matters. We bring this to the attention of USTR for 3 reasons. Number one is that not only are those costs coming, this is coming to Eastern Canada soon. The company has already expressed an intent to file a similar claim in the coming months. We fear that that will have a contagion effect on the Canada-U.S. cross-border building supply industry, as well as affect the NAFTA modernization project from a public perception. Secondly, there is some hypocrisy in the Canadian position on softwood lumber. With now, as we well know, Canada, the government of Canada is pointing at U.S. home builders that the U.S.'s imposition of duty is impacting U.S. home builders here. The fact is they haven't taken care of their own contractors in Canada. Our contractors are similarly situated to U.S. home builders. One key difference, we actually have an order in this instance that says Canada's imposition of duties is against the public interest of Canada. And last but not least, the dispute resolution mechanism. Canada has repeatedly argued that Chapter 19 is not only a red line, but required because U.S. domestic fora are unfair, are inherently unfair. In this instance, we have contractors here that have pursued their claims in a Canadian domestic forum, have received an order, yet Canada has failed to implement the same. It is axiomatic in trade law. You need to clean up your side of the street before you start pointing the fingers at your neighbors. I yield back my time. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, that concludes direct testimony.
Thank you to our 3 panelists. We have a series of questions that we will ask, and we have joining us from the State Department, Mitch Ferguson. Do you want to ask the first question?
Yes, Chairman. Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Kaczynski, in your written testimony, you emphasized that a unified process should be required to obtain the regulatory approvals necessary to build or modify international crossings. Can you explain more what you mean by unified process? And is this a similar process that you believe would also take a look at the economic need for new bridges?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Ferguson. To answer your second question first, it could. That could certainly be a possibility. In terms of what we mean by a unified process, the conception that I would have would be that the approval process is it on? The approval process is by agreement between both sides of the border, and that there's an agreement that regulations and laws that relate to the approval of these kinds of projects apply evenly. That is the issue that we have. Our issue is that there are laws that are being applied to our approvals that are not being applied to the approvals for the competing Canadian government bridge. And in our view, that's an unfair circumstance. And so what we would suggest is a process whereby there's a guarantee that the playing field is level, and that if one or other side of the relationships wants to apply a regulation, that regulation simply apply evenly to both. Thank you.
Thanks. Can I turn to Peter Meyer from the Treasury Department for a question?
Thank you. Got a question for Mr. Ukso. Has your alliance raised your concerns directly with the Canadian government relating to your concerns on the trade remedy issue? If so, what was the Canadian government's response?
Absolutely, and that's precisely why we're here today. We have exhausted all avenues in the domestic fora, including
not only through litigation, but through other meetings in this process. The response has been in our meetings, while it's been somewhat vague, is that a great deal of this is tied to the softwood lumber dispute, in that as the U.S. has imposed duties, and certainly as we saw this week, those are in a preliminary fashion around 37% for the overwhelming majority, is that it was going to be difficult for the government of Canada to then be seen through the public perception as giving a duty holiday to the Americans, but nevertheless, it's the Canadian contractors that would be receiving the benefit. So there are political circumstances here. We also think, in our position is, and looking and trying to figure out why they just won't implement the order that the Canadian International Trade Tribunal recommended, is that it is tied to strengthening the hand in Canada's negotiating position on the Chapter 19 provisions. Our alliance has become the bargaining chip in this, and they feel betrayed by their government. We have done everything we can in domestic fora to try to resolve this issue, and our fear is that this will, as it spreads throughout Canada, have a contagion effect on all of the NAFTA modernization efforts as this gathers more steam, as prices continue to rise, and ultimately those are going to be passed on to the Canadian consumer. That will then raise greater concerns about what's happening in the cross-border construction supply chain and whether NAFTA is providing the benefits received. We want to nip it in the bud now, and all that needs to be done is implement the order, give the duty holiday, and let's move forward and work these issues out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Spending a lot of time on trade remedy issues with Canada, if I could ask a couple of factual questions. So I'm not clear on what the current status is in terms of what duty rate is being paid. Is there an annual review process going that has been begun on the original order itself, or if you could fill in those details?
Sure. The original order on the anti-dumping of the U.S. companies is in full force in effect. It's 200% duties with the other export rate ranging up to 350%. For our specific set of contractors under a limited number of product lines, it's 43%. What the government of Canada did do, as we've been in meetings with them, is eliminate the duty holiday, but backdate the 43% duties to January. So instead of saying, we'll give you a duty holiday from January to July, you'll just now start paying that duty rate of 43%. That, of course, was once zero. That is to be implemented over a 5-year period. The problem is the market is reacting to that. We're seeing prices continue to go up at a 6% clip, and other building products are starting to pay a premium on that. And as I noted, what we're also seeing, of course, is other companies around the world are recognizing that Canada can't meet this demand. So we're starting to see distributors start to gain that supply. There was some overage of supply. There was still some wholesale gypsum out there for this building season, but that's what's happening now. We're running through that at this point. So now they're purchasing supply, and as they're looking, as prices are up with duties, they're reaching out to Mexico. The distributors are and elsewhere. So we actually believe that the impacts of this are going to be felt more on the industry in that July period forward. But the short answer, that was a long-winded answer to a very simple question, our contractors are paying 43% and have been since September of last year.
All right, let's mix it up here. Let me ask a question for Ms. Herman. Can you further describe to us the impact that your proposed addition to the IP chapter would have, not on the Canadian industry, but on the U.S. industry?
Well, a number of companies that do business here in the United States also have branches that do business in Canada, and so we've got a number of members who have reached out to us in terms of the overall benefit to an international company.
So you expect companies on both sides of the border would benefit from the changes that you're proposing?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Let me turn to Ed Gresser for a question.
Yes, further to the trade remedy question, do you have thoughts or data on the loss of revenue or job effects, either within your alliance or among the American drywall exporters, that this action is bringing?
Certainly, and throughout the proceedings, we were attempting to quantify that number. Of course, we would rely on the U.S. producers to put forth their effects, and I think they are gathering that information using other channels here in the United States to to advance their issues. But for our contractors, we are seeing losses of approximately 1.5 million. For a group of about 6 contractors, it was a loss of 1.5 million in the first month that this was on. They are guesstimating that that's doubling at a clip of about 2.5 times that throughout the pendency. So if you multiply that by about 800 contractors that are impacted by this issue in Canada, we are talking in the hundreds of millions of dollars and between Canada and the United States. Eventually, they're going to have to start laying off employees and passing these costs on, because there's only so much that the consumer can absorb in terms of the housing market. So they'll have to start laying off. There will be a slowdown in building, and some of this building is occurring in Fort McMurray, which was devastated by wildfires about a year ago as well. And as I indicated, this is coming to Eastern Canada very soon. So this market, in kind of an interesting trade remedy, they were able to divide the market between Western and Eastern Canada, which was somewhat extraordinary given the Canadian International Trade Tribunal precedent on this effect. But we know that it's coming to Eastern Canada next. And keep in mind that this company operates in both, this is a French-owned company that operates in both Canada and the United States. This was entirely to gain a competitive advantage vis-a-vis its competitors in the United States. They've been able to manipulate the domestic trade remedies for them. And unfortunately, that's what the public interest process is for, is to stop this very type of behavior. But Canada just hasn't implemented the order. And really, that's all we're asking for, is implement the order. But we are deeply concerned about the intermediate and long-term effects that this is going to have on the cross-border building supply chain. And we're happy to augment the record, of course, excuse me, Mr. Chairman. We're happy to augment the record with any additional data upon request on job.
Could I ask Mr. Cho from the Commerce Department to ask a question?
Thank you. Back to Mr. Kalzinski. Mr. Kalzinski, your fourth objective, as presented in your summary of testimony, seeks to, quote, preserve and strengthen private enterprises' ability to obtain relief when their rights are violated by allowing parties to seek equitable relief in addition to damages. Have you found that the Canadian and/or U.S. courts do not provide adequate protection?
Mr. Cho, thank you for the question. I wouldn't say that I'm an expert on NAFTA remedies, but my understanding of that point is that the NAFTA chapter on remedies has some limitations as it relates to those types of requested reliefs. So the point that we were making here is that we think that the full panoply of remedies that are available in U.S. courts and Canadian courts, for that matter, should be available through the NAFTA forum as well.
Thank you. That exhausts our questions to the panel here today. We thank you for submitting written testimony, for traveling to Washington and presenting your oral testimony and speaking with us and responding to our questions. We are in the middle of our NAFTA review at this point, so this is very important to us, and obviously we'll continue for most of the afternoon, but appreciate your particular participation today. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Again, my name is Dan Utso. I'm an international trade and customs attorney with the law firm of Dickinson Wright, which was in turn a firm founded in the 1870s in Detroit. Our offices in Canada, actually this week, they were founded back in Confederation, and this week, that makes the math easy. Canada will be celebrating its 150th birthday, and we just want to say happy birthday to our Canadian colleagues that on Canada Day on Saturday will be celebrating. But we are one of the only law firms that operates not only in Canada and the United States, but in the key Canada, U.S., and North American trading corridors in Ontario, Michigan, Ohio, where I live, down throughout the U.S. Southeast and out to the U.S. Southwest. Along the way, we have established or lead many of the regional Canada-U.S. business groups, and as was indicated, it's my privilege to appear here today on behalf of the Ohio-Canada Business Association, affectionately known as OhioCan. Of course, OhioCan, the Canada-U.S. Business Association in Detroit, Windsor, and the American Chambers of Commerce in Canada, where we serve on the Managing Council and on the National Board. In terms of our membership, I'd refer the panel to our FRN submission. Suffice it to summarize, we represent the major Canada, U.S., and North American companies, as well as all the way down the supply, value, and innovation chains to the small and medium-sized enterprises and first-time exporters and startups. It's on behalf of those individuals that I'll speak today, particularly Section O of the FRN, focused on small and medium-sized businesses. Our threshold consideration is that we agree with the underlying rationales of do no harm with one important caveat. Do no harm cannot mean maintaining the status quo or merely tweaking the agreement. Two rationales compel that conclusion. First, the politics. We live and work in Michigan, Ohio, Western Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, North Carolina, in these places. Voters have been activated on trade. I originally grew up in Youngstown, Ohio, a community in between Cleveland and Pittsburgh, where NAFTA is not a four-letter word, but is usually preceded or followed by one. In those communities, to folks back home, do no harm from folks in Washington or other members of the business community will mean they ain't doing anything for us. Those folks will run to the extremes of either party in the midterm elections, thereby creating even greater uncertainty to the business community that operates between Canada, U.S., and North America. Additionally, from our members' perspective, while the NAFTA has and Canada-U.S. trade have created great economic benefits and job creation in our region, they have also, the NAFTA is outdated. In terms of the Congressional Research Service report of May 24th indicates that most of the gains from NAFTA have been met up to really by the turn of the last century, coming into the 21st century. The time is now to enhance and modernize this agreement, and we encourage, while we recognize the need for speed in terms of the politics, both in Mexico, the midterms, TPA 2015, and Canada's elections in 2019, we need to take the time to get it right. We believe that the political and economic white space exists if the U.S. uses the North American Leaders Summit opportunity this year to bring the three leaders together here in the United States, not in some exotic location on the coast, but in the equally exotic locations of Detroit, Cleveland, or Pittsburgh, to show that the administration is working to get the job done and to do it, and as I said, to do it right in this time. I'll conclude my comments by offering that getting it right includes a quadruple E strategy surrounded around 4 E's. First, demonstrating that the NAFTA and Canada-U.S. trade is an example for the rest of the world. Secondly, in doing so, embedding the successes that we've had over the last decade and a half, in particular the beyond the border and regulatory cooperation initiatives. With regard to the latter, we have engaged in an exhaustive study and meetings with regulators, as well as with the Office of Management and Budget, and then the Privy Council Office, now the Treasury Board of Canada. What was surprising to us in that review are there is very little legal or regulatory framework to engage in regulatory convergence in terms of joint monitoring, inspections, or otherwise. We also say in terms of the enhancements that are needed to the agreement, no modernization of the NAFTA can occur without addressing workforce mobility. It is the biggest challenge that small and medium-sized enterprises face between Canada and the United States and in North America. While much of this discussion has focused on the NAFTA professional list, we encourage USTR to look at the business visitor provisions that don't require any statutory authority or to act in contravention of the Sensenbrenner rule. It really requires updating field manuals that are used by customs and other officials. I refer the panel to the rest of our submissions and areas that we've talked about evolutionizing the agreement and looking for exemptions or exceptions to what will be the trade enforcement provisions that USTR follows. I thank you for the time and yield the remainder of my time. Thank you.
Our next witness is Virginia Beckett, Deputy Director of the Canadian American Business Council. Ms. Beckett, you have 5 minutes.
Hi there. My name is Virginia Beckett, and I'm here today representing the Canadian American Business Council. We appreciate
Pull your mic a tiny bit closer, if you would, please.
We appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today on behalf of our members and to add our views on the upcoming renegotiation of NAFTA. The CABC is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to tackling issues that affect businesses in Canada and the United States. Our aim is to maximize competitiveness for companies large and small on both sides of the border. It goes without saying that it's a fascinating time for Canada-U.S. policy matters. But as always, the CABC is focused on the common ground and uncommon friendship that has long existed between the U.S. and Canada, and the enduring, profound, and productive trade and business ties that bind our two countries. When President Trump announced his intentions to engage in NAFTA renegotiations in February, the CABC saw an opportunity to strengthen the bilateral relationship. But it's not an opportunity without risk. NAFTA is, after all, a 23-year-old trade agreement. You might call it vintage. Don't get me wrong, vintage is great, even profitable when it comes to certain things like cars, fashion, or wine. But when it comes to the rules of engaging in the modern economy, vintage is less than ideal. To illustrate my point of just how old NAFTA is, let me say that I was in kindergarten when NAFTA was enacted. At that time, nobody could Google what is NAFTA on their smartphone, nor could you order authentic Canadian maple syrup on Amazon Prime for 2-day delivery. Since NAFTA was signed into agreement, we have seen 5 US presidents, 6 Canadian prime ministers, and 34 seasons of The Bachelor franchise. President Trump was simply a Manhattan real estate mogul, and Prime Minister Trudeau was a university student at the time. But beyond pop culture references, some of the biggest and most robust sectors of the North American economy simply did not exist when NAFTA was enacted. And so it's in legitimate need of an update. And we welcome the chance to help bring NAFTA into the modern era. However, it's no secret that renegotiation can be a complicated process. We urge that the process happens in a quick and constructive manner that does not create uncertainty for businesses or remove the clarity that the current agreement provides. Along with the request for an efficient and constructive renegotiation process, the CABC has come up with a list of suggestions on how to grow the Canada-US economy through NAFTA renegotiation. In the interest of time, I will give you a few highlights from our list. The first recommendation is simple: create a chapter in NAFTA on regulatory cooperation that codifies and strengthens the Canada-US Regulatory Cooperation Council as a permanent entity. Formally recognizing the RCC in a new NAFTA would ensure governments work in tandem on new regulations and that they align existing regulations. Our second recommendation is to enhance protection of intellectual property, including, but not limited to, exploring policy options in Canada to counteract judicial interpretations of IP rules, which serve to invalidate long-standing pharmaceutical patents. Number 3 involves the establishment of rules to promote and govern digital trade, including provisions prohibiting data localization and digital customs duties, enabling cross-border data, and securing basic non-discrimination principles for digital products. We will have additional detail on what a digital chapter in NAFTA could look like in the months ahead. Last on our list today is updating the rules governing the movement of people across our common border to reflect modern categories of employment, including those who work in the digital economy. These recommendations might not be easy, but they are possible, and if achieved, could provide a meaningful boost to the flow of commerce, the pace of trade, and the health of the economies of both Canada and the United States. They would lead to minimal disruption and, in fact, would ease regulatory burdens on countless businesses and identify industries on both sides of the 49th parallel. We're heading into a dynamic new age of technological advances that are demanding the United States and Canada come together as partners like never before. There are countless areas of goodwill and cooperation between our two countries that we would both be wise to capitalize upon. Now is the time to focus on the positive, to keep our eye on the prize, and remember, as always, that every long-term relationship has its chilly periods. The trick is to look for the bright spots, the shared goals, and the common ground that ensure the Canada-US relationship remains as vital and robust as always. Thank you for the opportunity to provide our thoughts today.
Our next witness is Catherine Friedman, Principal Investigator with the Binational Prosperity Initiative of the University of Buffalo. Ms. Friedman, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning. Again, my name is Catherine Friedman. I am a Research Associate Professor of Law and Planning at the University of Buffalo, a Global Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center down here in Washington, their Canada Institute, and as just mentioned and most pertinent to this hearing, Principal Investigator of an effort that we call cross-border prosperity and innovation. This is an effort that we have undertaken with colleagues at Brock University, the Buffalo Niagara Chamber of Commerce, the Niagara County Chamber of Commerce, and chambers of commerce in throughout Southern Ontario to think about how we can leverage ourselves as a binational region in a globalized world and actually leverage synergies of the border to create economic growth and prosperity. For those of you who may not know, the binational Buffalo-Niagara region, depending on how you cut it, has over 10 million people. Tons of goods cross our border every day through 4 land border crossings and 1 rail border crossing. Thousands of people cross the border every day for work, for school, for healthcare, for leisure, for arts and culture, and most importantly, for hockey. Up to 20% of season ticket holders for the Buffalo Sabres hail from Canada. Up to 30% of Buffalo Bills fans hail from Southern Ontario. So it is a very vibrant binational region that relies on strong binational economic ties. It's woven into the fabric of our daily lives. Under the Cross-Border Innovation and Prosperity Initiative, Brock University and UB convened regional stakeholders in early June to get a sense as to what businesses in the region wanted with respect to a modernized NAFTA. Almost 80% of the participants who attended our workshop represented companies and business trade organizations. More than 2/3 of those folks identified themselves as representing small to medium-sized enterprises. We submitted written comments a couple of weeks ago and highlighted 5 top regional recommendations regarding NAFTA modernization. Ranging from strengthening border infrastructure with both staff and resources, as my colleague from the CABC suggested, permanently embedding and expanding the Regulatory Cooperation Council into a modernized NAFTA, incorporating a Canadian exemption into Buy American, modifying rules of origin with regard to NAFTA, but I will just spend my remaining 2 minutes focusing on the #1 recommendation from our region, which is strengthening mobility of skilled workers and professionals between Canada and the United States. Specifically with regard to this issue, participants suggested that when NAFTA was negotiated, it revolutionized trade by negotiating Chapter 16 temporary entry for business purposes. And in the early days of the agreement, NAFTA did a good job of facilitating labor across the Canada-US border. However, like my CABC colleague, participants think that the list of professionals is sorely outdated. It has to be updated to take into account new industries and new occupations. It's no longer relevant for the modern workforce and does not reflect the technological changes that have overtaken our economies in the 21st century. A computer systems analyst is the only category listed in NAFTA for computer-related fields. Suggested additions to the list include a physician's assistant, software developer, a financial analyst, a nurse practitioner, and IT consultant. In addition to enhancing the list of professionals, participants also encouraged that highly skilled employees who may not have a college education but have specific skills that they bring to the table, should also be included in NAFTA to make obtaining a TN work permit easier for those folks. Finally, participants recommended that the parties establish a quote-unquote nimble process, perhaps a biannual working committee, to revisit business immigration practices and update the list when necessary. Thank you very much.
The next witness is Manuel Milano with the Mexico Institute of Competitiveness. Mr. Milano, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
My name is Manuel Molano. I am a Mexican economist and the Deputy Director of the Mexican Institute for Competitiveness, IMCO, a private, nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank in Mexico. Thanks for the invitation. I will summarize in 3 points our proposal on what the objectives for the NAFTA negotiations should be. 1. The primary objective should be to increase the competitiveness of the North American region. NAFTA has increased our region's trade. Since NAFTA was enacted, our joint trade with the rest of the world has doubled. NAFTA's potential outperforms the world's other major regions. The United States' innovation and deep capital markets, Canada's financial stability and abundant natural resources, and Mexico's young and energetic population are a winning combination. However, other regions are also pushing forward. From the year 2000 to date, China's total exports have grown eightfold. In the same period, the European Union's total exports grew by 119%, while NAFTA's exports grew by only 87%. The upcoming negotiation must be viewed as an opportunity to revamp North American competitiveness. Consumers in the region should be at the center of the debate. Our governments should defend the right of citizens to have access to cheaper and more diverse products and services. Each year, roughly 2 million consumers in the U.S. buy a car manufactured in Mexico, with 41% of parts coming from the USA. This depends on North American technology and finance, the regional supply chain, and the quality of assemblers on the three sides of the two borders. The regional cost structure allows us to produce and export vehicles at a competitive price. A return to protectionism will impede this and harm households and companies in our three economies. 2. Another important objective must be to preserve our mutually beneficial partnership. According to a 2014 year's study by the Peterson Institute for International Economics, based here in Washington, NAFTA has not fueled the U.S. trade deficit, and there is general consensus among many economists that the trade deficit can be explained by an imbalance between savings and investment in the U.S., has not raised U.S. unemployment, has not depressed wages across the board in the U.S. In addition, there is no evidence of connection between U.S. agricultural exports and illegal immigration. In fact, immigration from Mexico to the U.S. has diminished during the recent years, to the point where net migration is currently negative. While the Mexican economy did not grow as expected, many of the regions within Mexico have become prosperous partners of the US and Canada. Our joint population pyramid is more robust than that of competing regions. The NAFTA population under 30 years of age is 44% of the total population, while the same group in China is 42%, in Europe 34%, and in Japan 29%. A young population is important for many reasons, including a healthy ratio of workers to non-workers, affordability of healthcare and pensions, and long-term expectations. Newer challenges for regulation, such as electronic commerce and services trade, must also be discussed. Issues like labor and environmental regulations, dispute settlement mechanisms, governance, public procurement, corruption, and security will certainly be on the negotiating table. However, the spirit of the treaty should be preserved. NAFTA was born to remove tariff, regulatory, tax, subsidy barriers to trade. Parallel agreements could be signed on each of the new issues of interest. 3. NAFTA has been a boon to investment, trade, and consumer choice. The agreement has been beneficial to our three economies. NAFTA must be relaunched as a tool to create North American prosperity, opportunities, and goodwill. The freedom to trade is also freedom to choose. Greater diversity and availability of goods and services, as well as lower prices, are a good reason to allow everyone to trade freely. While supermarkets in New York or Mexico City sells millions of different products, less open places do not. In our vicinity, declining economies can blame trade isolation for much of their woes. It is in the interest of the U.S. to have a prosperous southern partner. Mexico is the U.S.'s third largest goods trading partner and is the second largest importer of U.S. goods and services. 22 American states depend on Mexico as an important destination for exports. Nearly 5 million jobs in the U.S. depend on trade relations with Mexico. Despite the difference in size between our economies, the U.S. economy is 15 times bigger than Mexico's. Mexico has also become an increasing investment force in the U.S. The total stock of Mexican direct investment in the U.S. is close to $36 billion. Mexican companies are invested mainly in food, plastics, business services, metals, auto components, and hospitality sectors in the U.S. Our continued joint progress depends largely on NAFTA and its possibilities. It is in the interest of the three countries that our integration as a competitive region continues. Our shared challenges are many, but so are the opportunities for our countries. May God help us all in reaching a beneficial negotiation for the three countries. Thank you.
The next witness is Ivo Enchev, President of the Canadian Bar Association. Mr. Enchev, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. My name is Ivo Enchev, and I'm the president of the Canadian Bar Association, or CABA. CABA is an associational forum and voice for the cross-border legal community. Our members include lawyers in private practice, in-house counsel, government lawyers, and law faculty and students. CABA wishes to focus its submissions today on the continuing relevance of the NAFTA TN visa category for lawyers, which authorizes Canadian and U.S. lawyers to work for sponsoring employers in the partner country. According to the Department of State, almost 15,000 TN visas, including for lawyers, were issued in the U.S. in 2016. The lawyer TN benefits the U.S. legal services industry and the wider U.S. economy in a number of respects. First, the lawyer TN helps to bolster the legal expertise of large, full-service U.S. law firms handling complex cross-border matters. Those matters can range from mergers and acquisitions and the cross-listing of securities to cross-border bankruptcies and dueling or parallel class actions. Over 15 major U.S. firms have an office in Canada, or a dedicated Canada practice group. The U.S. legal services industry as a whole is worth over $250 billion. Canada is the third biggest destination for U.S. legal exports, totaling over $600 million, or 10% in 2013. A statement supporting the TN, delivered to CABA by Paul Weiss, an elite New York law firm of over 900 lawyers that has a Canada practice group and a dedicated Toronto office, puts it this way. The complex legal work that we do for our clients with business in Canada requires that we have attorneys well-versed in legal and cultural issues on both sides of the border, and that these attorneys be able to move freely between both countries. Some of CABA's individual members also describe how the TN visa has been critical to helping them build up the Canada-U.S. practices of their small firms and their mid-size or larger commercial or immigration practices. One immigration lawyer credits the TN for helping his firm grow from a 35-lawyer California startup to a national firm of 165 lawyers. Second, the TN enables the very top U.S. law firms to compete for the best Canadian legal talent. Top legal talent is one reason that U.S. firms account for 75 of the top 100 law firms in the world by revenue. As Paul Weiss again puts it in its letter, the competition for top talent among top law firms is fierce, and through the TN program, we're able to increase the talent pool that is available to us. Third, the TN assists in the delivery of cross-border legal services to established industries, like oil and gas and financial services, which are big contributors to the U.S. and Canadian economies. Fourth, the TN advances the business development goals of U.S. firms by bridging any cultural divides between them and their Canadian clients. The legal industry is, after all, a service industry. Better service means appreciating unspoken assumptions and context, as well as the client's business and the culture in which it operates. And finally, the growth of the technology sector has only increased the importance of the lawyer TN. Online businesses operate in a borderless medium across the US and Canadian border. At the same time, tech startups nurtured in the Kitchener-Waterloo corridor in Canada are migrating into US markets. All to say that the lawyer category TN's best days still lie ahead of it. Those are CABA submissions. Thank you.
The final witness on this panel is Greg Heffley, Director of Federal Relations with the American Cancer Society. Mr. Heffley, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today on the goals and objectives for negotiating a modernized NAFTA. ACS CAN, or the American Cancer Society.
If you would, pull your mic a little closer for me, please.
ACS CAN, or the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network, is the nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy affiliate of the American Cancer Society, and we support evidence-based policy and legislative solutions designed to eliminate cancer as a major health problem. You invited comments on product-specific negotiating objectives as well as relevant investment issues that should be addressed in negotiating a modernized NAFTA. Tobacco products are unlike any other legal consumer product. They are highly addictive, and they are the #1 preventable cause of death in the United States and around the world. Tobacco use kills 480,000 people in the United States every year, and it kills more than 46,000 people in Canada every year and more than 46,000 people in Mexico annually. Globally, tobacco killed more than 100 million people in the 20th century and is on track to kill 1 billion people this century unless governments take urgent action. Congress in 2009 passed the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act, granting the U.S. Food and Drug Administration the authority to regulate tobacco products and the marketing of those products. There's also a unique global consensus on actions governments should take to address the lethal impact of tobacco, which is reflected in the world's first and only health treaty, the WHO's Framework Convention for Tobacco Control, that has 180 parties, including Canada and Mexico. Unlike other areas of trade tensions between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, there's significant consensus on how to address the tobacco crisis. Yet nearly all existing trade and investment agreements continue to allow the tobacco industry to attempt to thwart the best efforts of sovereign governments and the public health community to stop the spread of tobacco use. The tobacco industry has a history of using agreements to generate disputes, to undermine tobacco product labeling and packaging requirements, and other ways nations have attempted to advance health objectives. Whether in the sovereign tobacco regulation context, or in trade and investment negotiations, or through international disputes, tobacco interests are intent on blocking effective domestic regulation of tobacco products to the detriment of public health. That is why we advocate for the preservation of sovereign rights of governments to regulate tobacco products, and that's why the United States, Canada, and Mexico agreed to include in the negotiated Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade and Investment Agreement Article 29.5 to deny benefits of the investment chapter with respect to claims challenging tobacco control measures. A tobacco exception, such as the one agreed to by the United States Trade Representative in the TPP negotiations, which protects tobacco control measures from challenges from tobacco companies, would be a major step forward in addressing investment dispute disruptions generated by the tobacco industry. In fact, inclusion of such a provision in a renegotiated NAFTA would affirm a critical area of commonality of interest that already exists between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. It would provide protection as the U.S. Food and Drug Administration implements Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act regulation, and as Canada and Mexico regulate tobacco products consistent with their obligations as parties to the FCTC. Maintaining the sovereignty of nations as they take steps to protect their citizens from the ravages of tobacco would not undermine the broader trade goals of NAFTA. Ambassador Lighthizer recently told Congress in discussing the investor-state dispute settlement provision that he wanted to engage to see what can be done to rebalance where we are. Negotiating inclusion of a tobacco exception in a renegotiated NAFTA would be an excellent start. We appreciate having the opportunity to comment on this critical trade and health issue, and also call your attention to another submission that was submitted on behalf of 28 public health and medical provider groups urging protection of tobacco control measures from investment challenges, signed by organizations such as the American Academy of Family Physicians, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Heart Association, American Lung Association, Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, the American Public Health Association, the March of Dimes, and the National African American Tobacco Prevention Network. We look forward to working with the United States government as its NAFTA negotiating positions are developed and as negotiations proceed. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, that concludes direct testimony from this panel.
Thanks to all our panelists. We have prepared several questions based on your written testimony, and we'll try and react to what you may have said here orally. Can I start with John Anderson from the Commerce Department?
Thank you, John, and thank you to each of the witnesses for your testimony. Ms. Beckett, in your oral testimony, written and oral testimony, which by the way makes me feel incredibly old since I was on the team that negotiated the U.S.-Canada.
That wasn't my intention, I promise.
So I predate NAFTA by a few years. You indicated that you would encourage NAFTA parties to enshrine the U.S.-Canada Regulatory Cooperation Council in a modernized NAFTA. From your perspective, how would or should the United States and Canada include Mexico in a new regulatory cooperation chapter?
Well, our comments here today are specific to the bilateral relationship between Canada and the U.S., and while we would encourage including Mexico into this regulatory cooperation, we are focused on the bilateral relationship and are hoping that we can have a solution that is mutually agreed upon.
Let me turn to Amy Holman from the State Department.
Thank you, John, and thanks to our panelists for coming in some cases traveling down to meet with us today. Mr. Usko, in your written testimony, you mentioned that the CUSBA is, quote, encouraged by the concept of unified cargo processing that has been deployed at the Arizona ports of entry along the Mexican border, unquote. How would including this provision in NAFTA benefit your members? Thank you.
Certainly, and the same would hold true for not only CUSBA and Detroit-Windsor, but for the Ohio-Canada Business Association, as well as so many of our advanced manufacturers over the past not only 20, 30 odd years since NAFTA and the free trade agreement beforehand, but the Canada-U.S. free trade agreement, or excuse me, the Canada-U.S. Auto Pact of the 60s. We've been trilateralizing our supply chains forever and a day now throughout the latter half of the 20th century. If we say that a first principle in the NAFTA needs to be embedding the gains that we made over the past decade in border security management and facilitation, chief among them the beyond the border process between Canada and the United States, but that also there have been significant innovations on the U.S.-Mexico border. That pilot project has worked extremely well. We also run the Canada, or in the leadership position of the Canada-Arizona Business Council down in Phoenix, and that is where a great deal of that experience comes from as well. And we're seeing that is directly relevant to our companies in Detroit and Ohio. The idea that we need to move goods and services as expeditiously as possible and safely in North America is critical to job creation and investment in places like Ohio, Michigan, Western PA, et cetera.
Thank you.
I'll ask Peter Meyer to provide a question.
Thank you. Ms. Friedman, in your comments, you highlighted that a number of the priorities identified under the Bilateral Prosperity Initiative, including simplifying and aligning rules of origin, modernizing border infrastructure and technology. Can you tell us more about how these priorities would benefit U.S. companies and workers in doing business with Canada?
Certainly. Well, I think that investing in border infrastructure that facilitates the free flow of goods, people, and services across the border, that I think the term is pushes the border out from the actual physical border, it's generally viewed as a way to gain efficiencies in our economy and with companies, where, it's, just-in-time production, where waits at the border cause significant delay, and time is money in a lot of industries. And so the extent to which goods can be inspected and cleared away from the border, I think, is one example of investing in infrastructure to facilitate the flow of goods across the border. In the binational Buffalo-Niagara region, there was a pre-clearance program, a pilot program that was in place a couple of years ago. I don't have the cost savings numbers on me, but I could certainly get them for you if you're interested. But the delays, border time delays were significantly reduced, which again saved money for manufacturers, shippers, truckers, et cetera, et cetera. So when we talk about border infrastructure, we're specifically pre-clearance programs came up as part of that. And then the other issue you said was the rules of origin. So one of the participants suggested that I believe it was de minimis thresholds. If there were common rules of origin in NAFTA vis-a-vis some of the other trade agreements that the United States has entered into, it would just make it simpler for companies to, sort of calculate their the amount of product that they need in order to qualify under the agreements, and just reduce transaction costs for them, essentially. So that was the suggestion.
Thank you.
I'll ask Ed Gresser to provide a comment.
Thank you. This is a question for Dr. Milano. Your testimony stresses the importance of the NAFTA because of the benefits it brings to consumers in our three countries. One of the recommendations you make in support of that point is the need for all three NAFTA countries to improve data gathering and statistical analysis, including at the supply chain level, in order to better understand the agreement's benefits. Do you have some specific ideas or suggestions about how the three governments could achieve this, and what sort of provisions in the NAFTA itself would be appropriate to promote better data gathering?
Yes, and thanks for the question. The North American Free Trade Agreement had an information system together with it. The acronym in English is NAICS. I can spell it out in Spanish a lot easier, but it's our common ground, and we have common digits for most of the merchandises. And there's where the problem starts, because for Mexico, most of the commodities are at the 4-digit level, while in the U.S. you have at 6- and 8-digit level commodities. So that's one part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that we are not certain of how many times do the different components of a complex commodity like a car cross the border. So it very easily might be that we are overestimating some of the figures, such as the trade deficit, because maybe a car company that has a plant in Michigan and a plant in Querétaro, Mexico, just need to do a write-off on the debt accrued from one to the other, and that shouldn't be a part of the deficit. Being the deficit such an important issue right now, maybe we should think with together with the business chambers, since these are all trinational businesses, to provide some supply chain level data so we can know exactly where is the value added accrued. You've probably seen these, but an iPhone, most of the value is added in California, even though the device is actually manufactured in China. But the amount of value that's put into that device across the Pacific is tiny compared to the ingenuity and the innovation and the different thought processes that go behind it. So I do think that this is exactly the case with the U.S. and Canada and Mexico. The American content of many of these industry-related services might be a lot more than our statistics say. And 23 years ago, our economies were rather isolated, and it made sense to make country-level kind of data. But now we need regional-level kind of data. And thanks for the question.
John Anderson, could you provide a question?
Mr. Enchev, in your comments, you highlighted a number of important issues related to e-commerce and the digital economy, including privacy and freedom of speech. Do you have specific ideas about how to address these issues in the NAFTA, given the need to strike a balance with the legitimate interest of the internet and content providers?
Thank you very much for your question. One of the reasons we focused our submissions today on the TN visa was because we don't yet have a developed position on how effort to restrain extraterritorial orders against internet companies intersects with free trade. But we did want to simply note that this is an issue that is going to come up ever more as commerce moves online and courts of various jurisdictions issue orders that restrict or restrain the conduct of internet entities worldwide.
I'll take a question for Mr. Heifley. You've talked about investor-state dispute settlements and other forms of dispute settlement with respect to government's ability to develop and implement tobacco control measures. And of course, we have a long experience under NAFTA with investor-state disputes, and now we've seen some results, some outcomes from investor-state disputes in the tobacco sector, particularly the Philip Morris recent losses in its ISDS claims against Uruguay and Australia. So could you comment on how that experience impacts your view of the ISD system that has been in our trade agreements?
Thank you for the question. And of course, we are grateful for the victories of Uruguay and Australia in the disputes that Philip Morris International pursued. But while winning the cases, there's another set of collateral damage that happens because of the initiation of those disputes. To the tobacco industry, time is money. Delay is money. Delay is continued addiction and getting new smokers to start. And for public health, delay is very costly in terms of disease and death. As a result of those disputes, even though ultimately the two countries were successful, there were a number of countries that delayed or chose not to take action because they simply didn't want to be or couldn't afford to be the victims of a targeted dispute initiated under any investor-state provision that they could have been vulnerable under of just the initiation of this dispute, regardless of the merits. And so I think that the exception that was negotiated in TPP, while is helpful so that you don't have to litigate, at least in the investor-state context, the merits, it certainly saves you also from the chilling effect that the potential of a dispute would have and the cost of defending a dispute, even though you might ultimately win, which can be tremendous. Australia, it's said, spent as much as $50 million defending that case. And we know that a number of countries, while that case was going on, delayed or chose not to adopt various tobacco control measures, and that costs lives. And so from our perspective, the exception that was negotiated in TPP addresses the bigger issue that we face when a litigious industry uses the mechanisms available to it. Even if they don't win on the merits, they win by delay.
Thank you. Amy Holben, could I ask you to pose another question?
Sure, thanks, John. Again, a question for Mr. Usko. You recommend that a modernized NAFTA, quote unquote, embed the U.S.-Canada Beyond the Border Initiative, also known as BTB. Given that BTB was focused on perimeter security and trade facilitation, what are your specific recommendations and top priorities for incorporating B2B into what you term as, quote unquote, NAFTA Next? Thank you.
Certainly, and thank you for the question. And dovetailing a bit off my prior response as well, is we think that this would be a number one priority, is taking the gains that we've made on B2B. Because if the border doesn't work, North American trade doesn't work for all intents and purposes. And we witnessed that over the course in the period, in the post 9/11 period, really up until 2011, 2012. Within the priorities would be first, just ensuring that there is a mechanism for dialogue between the U.S. and Canada, and on a two-speed approach into Mexico as well. Right now, B2B essentially exists out as a separate agreement between the respective governments, almost an informal agreement in many ways. Let's embed it to ensure that successive administrations, as well as Congress, authorizes the continuation of a vehicle where the parties come together. In terms of specific priorities, number one is single window. We've made significant gains on the single window, which is particularly important to small and medium-sized exporters that are looking for one vehicle where they can enter through multiple participating government agencies that have customs clearance, that there's one portal in which to submit this data as we've added further technology to the border. Heretofore, up until really the last 6 to 8 months, single window has worked at fits and starts. So that would be a significant priority there. And again, B2B, the pre-clearance legislation that the U.S. passed that authorizes continued pre-clearance facilities in both the U.S. and in Canada, and we used the Mexico example a few moments ago. That legislation is pending in Canada. We need to get that passed. That agreement took several years to get into place. It was approved in May of 2015, and we're still waiting for the Canadian Parliament to pass that legislation, which would allow us to expand pre-clearance to more facilities that would further facilitate trade and travel between airports in Canada and the United States, and ultimately will allow us to move to a more 21st century border where we're parking customs agents at the large OEMs, at manufacturers themselves, so that we can get that traffic cleared, so that we can then focus and do a more risk-managed approach to trade that we don't know that's coming, where we haven't seen advanced reporting, and that'll help streamline the border and reduce the infrastructure costs needed to do so. So the mix of technology through single window, as well as allowing pre-clearance at the facilities themselves, would significantly advance Canada, U.S., and North American trade.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That exhausts our prepared questions. Let me ask the government panel if anyone has another comment or question. All right. Well, we will thank this large panel for your presentations here today, your oral testimony, and the prior written materials you've given to us. We are in the midst of our review of NAFTA renegotiation objectives and expect to be in contact, or would welcome contact with you as we go forward. And again, thank you for appearing here today.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to testify. And on behalf of our 1 million members and retirees, we really appreciate this opportunity to offer our input into the NAFTA renegotiation. I want to start off by saying that we strongly agree with President Trump and what he has been saying over the past many years, and that NAFTA has been a real failure for working families and for U.S. domestic manufacturing. It's been a bad deal, frankly, for workers in all three countries, and I want to make it clear that we are in solidarity with independent unions in Mexico and with Canadian unions in believing that more of the benefits from this trade agreement should go to the workers. We have not seen that previously under NAFTA. I think what's really important is that is to be ambitious here. And, the TPP should not be used as a model for most provisions. The labor chapter in TPP was woefully insufficient. We really have to look to new models and new ways of doing trade in order to truly fix the problems. When I say fix the problems, what am I talking about? Talking about a few things. One is that we need to turn things around so wages actually increase along with the auto production in all three countries. We also need to do something about something the President has identified many times, which is our enormous trade deficit, which is especially bad in auto manufacturing. The deficit has to be directly dealt with. So that's going to take a lot of thinking outside the box and, some really aggressive efforts if we're really going to fix NAFTA for the American workers. I also think it's really important that there be some core provisions that are in this. One, I think there has to be provisions, enforceable provisions against currency manipulation. We do not think there should be special protections for investors, ISDS. We do not think that belongs in the agreement. I think Buy America should not be threatened by NAFTA. We also think that rules of origin should be strengthened and loopholes closed to increase production within the NAFTA countries. But it's going to take, more than that, because what's really happened is you can look at the economics of what's happening with NAFTA. there's been a ton of auto production that's moved to Mexico, and then those exact same products are sold back into the United States. Closed down factories all over the country, directly displaced. That's been especially true it's in the 2005 over the last decade and a few years. We've really seen a direct correlation. Here are some of the companies that have located in Mexico over the past several years. Lear, Johnson Control, IAC, Flex and Gate, American Axle, Federal Mogul, Faurecia, Bosch, Magna, and I could go on and on and on. And I think it's important to realize, of course, the OEMs, the auto manufacturers, have also had a massive increase in investment in Mexico, often with a corresponding reduction in investment in the United States. So I think it's also really important for everyone to recognize that NAFTA directly hurts manufacturing workers all the time because it's a constant threat used, whether in organizing contract negotiations, implicitly and explicitly stated that, if you don't play ball, workers, if you don't, if you join up with the union or if you push for, better standards of living, we're going to move to Mexico. It's a common refrain. It's commonly understood from people that collectively bargain that there's this constant threat. So I think we really, you got to look at the situation. You got to look at the Mexican workers and their lack of rights. And I know others are testifying to that too, or have and will. But the reality is that you have very few independent unions in Mexico, and there has to be the right to collectively bargain there if we're going to lift up wages here and stop being such a drag. Just want to point out that auto parts manufacturing has ballooned. Our trade deficit with Mexico has gone up over 20-fold, and we have seen auto parts jobs decrease 36%. And remember, when you have an auto manufacturer, a lot of parts supply work follows that manufacturer. So when you see a manufacturer move, an OEM, an auto company, you see a flood of parts also follow them. So I think now's the time to be ambitious. I think we have to be honest about the failures of NAFTA, and I would just implore you to not be modest here and to not look at minor tweaks or the TPP and think that that in of itself is going to fix the problems. You have to be much more aggressive than we have in recent years if this is going to deliver for American workers and American economy. Thank you.
The next witness is Eric Rosenthal with Visual Effects Industry.
Hi, I'm Eric Rosenthal. I'm a visual effects artist from Los Angeles, California. I'd like to thank the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative for holding this meeting and letting me speak. So I've been doing visual effects for film and television for the past 15 years. So it is fun and rewarding days and tough and frustrating ones too. But the toughest part about it is watching the subsidies and tax incentives from foreign countries decimate our unique and American-born industry. Modern movies cost a lot of money, and a large part of their budgets go to visual effects. So you might think we have it pretty good. However, visual effects is a tough business with brutal competition, constant uncertainty, and razor-thin profit margins. And the foreign subsidies were a worse problem than any of those. The problems in our industry reached a boiling point at the 2013 Academy Awards. The movie Life of Pi, a critical and commercial success, won 4 Academy Awards, including Best Visual Effects. Meanwhile, Rhythm and Hughes, the company behind the movie's stunning visuals, was going bankrupt. Foreign subsidies had driven most of the big visual effects overseas, and Rhythm and Hughes could not get enough work to pay its bills. So we took action. We didn't have a lot of money or trade association to fight the subsidies. We organized, we hired a law firm, and attempted to apply the countervailing duties to visual effects, which are designed to counteract the types of subsidies that destroyed our industry. But it was too late, and we didn't have the money for a full legal effort. Thanks to the massive tax subsidies that Canada and other countries used to lure our industry out of the U.S., many of the big companies had already gone out of business. The ones that survived did so by moving most of their work to the countries that offered subsidies. Often employees face choices like, if you want to keep your job, you can move to Vancouver. Labor costs are a big part of our industry. It's understandable for companies to move abroad to save money, but the vast majority of the damage to our industry has been done by countries with the same labor costs as the U.S. Countries like Canada and their provincial governments have offered U.S. film producers like Warner Brothers, Disney, Fox, Universal, Paramount, and Sony massive subsidies that at one point combined to give them an uncapped subsidy of almost 60% of their labor costs. The damage inflicted on the domestic industry was almost immediate. The U.S. studios demanded that the visual effects facilities move as many of their workers to places like Vancouver so they can reap the subsidized government rebates. This caused many of my colleagues to lose their jobs, homes, and mortgages as they've had to move north to keep working. When multiple countries offer subsidies for visual effects, movie studios pit the countries against each other to drive up the amount of subsidies that they get paid. The studios win and the taxpayers lose. Similarly, U.S. states compete with each other to see who can offer the Hollywood studios the most money to film there. It's a race to the bottom, and the big losers are the taxpayers. We love movies and are passionate about our visual effects work. However, there's no reason why American taxpayers or taxpayers anywhere in the world should subsidize the entertainment industry on either the federal or state level. Proponents of subsidies, usually funded by the movie companies, say they stimulate economic growth. But objective studies of the effectiveness of film subsidies have concluded that they are almost always a waste of taxpayer money. They don't create any permanent industry. The film industry is very mobile. When a subsidy runs out or another location offers more money, a production can easily pull up their stakes and leave. With the renegotiation of NAFTA, we've seen a renewed effort to update our trade agreements to apply to digital industries like visual effects. What has occurred to the domestic VFX industry and has gone unchecked is exactly why anti-subsidy rules exist in so many trade agreements. Without any system to discipline them, domestic industries are destroyed, leading to the industry to become dependent on taxpayer money. This is the exact opposite of what free trade is intended to do. I urge the USTR and the Department of Commerce to take trade action against subsidies for digital industries like the VFX industry and end the cycle of displacement that has affected many of my friends and colleagues. Thank you.
The next witness is Jim Doyle with U.S. Competes Partnership. Mr. Doyle, you have 5 minutes. Can you use your microphone, please?
Thank you very much for your time. I've just got a few points.
I need you to pull it a little closer for me, please.
How's that? Does that work?
Raise it up a little bit. Now try.
How's this?
I'm not picking you up. It needs to be more in front of you. Has it stopped working completely? There you go.
Is that better?
All right, can you hear him in the back? No, they can't hear you.
I'll try to talk louder. Sorry about that. So my name is Jim Doyle. I'm with an organization called U.S. Competes. I used to serve in the Clinton Commerce Department. Have been following trade policy for the last 25 years and would like to talk specifically about currency manipulation, and I have just a few points. The first is it's critically important that the administration embrace currency manipulation with regard to NAFTA because it sets a clear signal to our future trading partners that this is an important priority for the administration. The administration is demonstrated that it's going to look for very quickly for a new deal with Korea and potentially a new deal with Japan, and those are countries where this issue is critically important. So dealing with it now with NAFTA just makes sense. Second, it's important to deal with it now because we're experiencing a lull in currency manipulation. And it's just better to go through and try to realize firm rules that follow IMF principles at a time when the countries aren't doing it. Third point is, if we wait until they start manipulating their currencies again, it's going to be too long. Studies have shown that the bulk of benefit of currency manipulation occurs in the first 8 to 12 months. And if we start negotiating once we've proven it's happening, much of the damage will be done. There are two points I think also are worth making with regard to currency manipulation in general. The first is that everyone does it. I hear that a lot when I talk to different people in town about that. And the fact is, a lot of countries do it, but they all do it to us. 2/3 of the currency manipulation that goes on across the world buys dollars. They're doing it to manipulate their currencies versus us. We're the principal victim of a global phenomenon, and we need to treat it that way. The second thing is, in briefings with congressional staff, I tend to hear a lot that it affects businesses where we're going to be losing out anyway, low-skill manufacturing, things like that. Well, the fact is that if you look at our 50 advanced industries as defined by Brookings and McKinsey and Company, these are the companies that invest most in R&D, that employ most of our scientists here in the country. They represent about 9% of our jobs. They produce 17% of our GDP. But they also do 90% of our R&D, 85% of our patents, and most importantly, they're responsible for 60% of our exports. These industries where we need to nurture, we need to promote, are big exporters, which means that when we don't step up on currency manipulation, we're affecting these industries dramatically. Finally, the Treasury Department's current policy of naming and shaming doesn't work for two very important reasons. The first is the countries that are manipulating their currency worry a lot less about being on a report issued by the Treasury Department twice a year than they do about their own voters. And so, the shame that we try to lay on them, it just doesn't seem to matter much to them. The second thing, in some cases, they're just dealing with an entirely different demonstration or definition of the concept. And to prove that, I'd be happy to submit as testimony a chart that juxtaposes statements by the United States government at the last 12 G7 and G20 finance meetings, with statements by the Japanese Ministry of Finance. And what you see is we say one thing and they say something entirely different. They're approaching it with an entirely different perspective, which means that the traditional approach of naming and shaming just doesn't work. Thank you very much for your time. I encourage you to include currency disciplines in the NAFTA negotiations. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, that concludes direct testimony from this panel.
Thank you. We have some time for questions. Let me turn to Amy Holman for a question to start us off.
Thank you, John, and thank you to our panelists for coming and sharing their views with us today. My question is for Mr. Nasser. Your testimony also referred to the importance of increased and stronger rules of origin to prevent non-parties from benefiting from NAFTA. Could you please explain for us how, in your view, U.S. workers are impacted by weak rules of origin, and what are some of your key proposals for the NAFTA rules of origin? Thank you.
Thank you for your question, and I just want to emphasize that rules of origin is one important component, but it's not a silver bullet. What strong rules of origin does is it increases, production within the NAFTA countries, which hopefully has some positive impact in the United States as far as direct employment. What we worry about is countries freeloading who aren't in the agreement, but yet reaping a lot of benefits. So we think that the documentation requirements in NAFTA are important, the tracing list. We also think that it makes sense to give some consideration to making some changes to the tracing list since it's dated. We also really believe that we should over time look for a higher number because that will reduce the countries that have nothing to do with NAFTA benefiting from the trade agreement. So those are some of the key proposals that we support. But again, we also got to take aggressive measures to actually directly reduce the trade imbalance with Mexico.
Thank you.
Ed Gresser, could you pose a question?
Yes, thank you. For Mr. Rosenthal, do you have statistics on how subsidies from Canadian provinces have affected the U.S. domestic visual effects industry as a whole? And in a way, a more conceptual question, as subsidies disciplines in trade agreements exist for goods, what is the good that VEI professionals modify or produce?
Oh, yeah. Thank you for your question. The good are visual effects shots for movies. And for a while, there was kind of a discrepancy on whether we provided a product or service since it's digital. But some of these recent rulings, and the MPAA actually supported this, that the visual effects were actually a product. So that could be, so they could be subject to the same countervailing duties and anti-dumping laws. And I don't have any statistics. There's been a lot of visual effects companies just in the past 10 years have just went out of business. But one thing that's prevented the problem from being solved is of the companies that manage to stay in business, they'd basically open up satellite offices in the subsidized countries. Like they would open up an office in Vancouver and send all their workers to Vancouver not to pick on Canada, it's a great country, but just in order to get the subsidies. So they were, instead of fighting against the subsidies, they kind of just went with them.
And we have, for this panel, Peter Meyer from the Treasury Department with a question.
Thank you, John, and thank you to the panel. I've got a question for Mr. Doyle regarding, in your written submission, you advocate for stronger rules concerning currency manipulation as a part of NAFTA renegotiations and express support for a three-part test to determine currency misalignment based on current account position, reserve accumulation, reserve adequacy. How would the rules that you propose address your currency concerns?
So there are a number of tests that have been suggested by a number of industry trade groups and think tanks. I think which test we pick is less important in how forcefully we enforce them. To show bipartisan support for this, one of the most compelling recommendations is from the Center of American Progress, which proposes a 90-day trigger on a test that looks a lot like everybody else. But they go on at length about the importance of automaticity here. That's the phrase that they keep on using in the report. The importance of making this automatic. So I believe there's general consensus on the different types of tests that could be used. The question is, how quickly do you apply them? If your department is going to wait for a year before it begins negotiations with a party, and if that party stops manipulating its currency after month 11, we're into month 11, then the rules just aren't strong enough. So in terms of the test, there's broad agreement on what they are. There are a number of sources that would be happy to provide for you. Where the real rub is how much do we do about it, and when do we do it, and how much discretion is the Treasury Department allowed to have, and what other equities are they going to consider when they decide whether to take action? Up to now, the Treasury Department hasn't really stepped up on this, that's why I think the Center for American Progress's approach of automaticity is an important thing to consider.
Thank you.
Let me ask another question of Josh, and let's focus on Mexico and its labor regime. You were quite critical of what is going on in Mexico. Historically, what we're seeing right now is they have passed constitutional amendments, and they're in the process of passing some implementing legislation. What should we be looking at as that process continues in terms of the quality of the reforms that they're making and evaluating the impact of those reforms on the operation of labor and labor union activity and so forth in Mexico?
I really appreciate that question, and I think an important thing to just note is that there have been actions taken before and pledges made that hasn't changed things on the ground in a positive way for workers. So we got to, as you said, we have to actually see the changes. A few things are manufacturing wages. How are the wages impacted by these changes? Did they rise? Right now, most Mexicans workers can't afford the cars they build. Another thing is we need to also really take a look at the actual collective bargaining struggles. I mean, are there fair union elections or not? Now there's a lot of horror stories about interference from management and really repressing workers. So our situation's changing on the ground when you actually have an organizing drive or a contract negotiation. That's important to monitor. The actual wages, the actual working conditions are some other things to keep a close eye on to see, if the impact is real. And we think that it's important to make sure the impact is real before we give more commercial benefits to Mexico. And it's also why we think there needs to be a stronger regime as far as repercussions when a country violates labor standards. In other words, we think that you should really look to, countervailing duties and such when a country is just consistently violating labor standards because it's an unfair subsidy. We should compete on a level playing field, not on repressing workers. Thank you for the question.
All right. Do the government panelists have any other comments or questions for this panel? Okay, well, thank you very much again for making the trip to Washington in some cases, for taking the time to explain your priority issues to us. This is part of an ongoing process, and we look forward to continued communication with you on modernizing the NAFTA. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to USTR, to Commerce, to Treasury, and to the State Department for your participation and leadership in holding these hearings and in conducting the exercise with respect to NAFTA. I'm president of CSI, which is the leading industry association devoted exclusively to promoting the international objectives of U.S. services companies and associations. Our members include a broad spectrum of U.S. services companies, from information technology, financial services, distribution, express delivery logistics, media, distribution, and professional services. I'm here today.
Christine.
Okay. Is that better? Okay. Thank you very much for that. I'm here today first and foremost to highlight the benefits to you, the U.S. services sector, from NAFTA. NAFTA provides U.S. services providers guaranteed non-discriminatory market access to Mexico and Canada. This includes the ability to provide services on a cross-border basis, major investment opportunities, and strong investment protections, and the opportunity to compete successfully for major government procurement contracts. The U.S. has maintained a consistent trade surplus in services with both Canada and Mexico. Most recent data indicates that the total U.S. services exports to Canada were $56 billion, producing a $27 billion services surplus. Similarly, in Mexico, U.S. exports of services were an estimated $31 billion, resulting in a 2016 surplus of roughly $7 billion. And it's notable, since 1999, that under NAFTA, the United States has doubled its bilateral services trade surplus with Mexico and quadrupled its services trade surplus with Canada. In total, U.S. trade with both Canada and Mexico in services exports alone amounts to about $88 billion as of 2015, and this directly supports about 587,000 American jobs, which are well-paying jobs, because research has shown that jobs in the services sectors that are tradable, which is about 40% of services sectors, tend to be in the professional services sectors, have produced high-skilled and high-paying jobs. The NAFTA rules and specific commitments that have promoted this tremendous growth in services trade and investment include the guarantee of non-discriminatory treatment, transparency, and binding dispute settlement and investor-state dispute settlement. As of 2013, U.S. foreign affiliates generated approximately $43 billion in sales in Mexico and $128 billion in sales in Canada. These figures are very important to the services sector because while many services can be supplied on a cross-border basis, there are many sectors in the services area that can only be supplied through investing and establishing a commercial presence. At the same time, this foreign investment yields significant benefits back to the United States in the form of revenues and support for U.S. jobs and operations. And just to give you one very concrete example of a major U.S. service supplier that has a huge investment in Mexico, that the returns on that investment help them and enable them to sustain the funds they need to be the largest agricultural lender in the United States. So there is real synergy here, and it's not just in financial services, but it extends to other important sectors in the economy. NAFTA has also produced significant Canadian and Mexican investment in the U.S., which supports the American economy. As of 2014, Mexico had invested nearly $18 billion in the U.S., and as of 2015, the United States accounted for almost half of Canada's global foreign direct investment, a total of $448 billion. The value of investment, both outward to Canada and Mexico, and in return from both of our trading partners, is a major accomplishment of NAFTA. NAFTA has also provided major procurement opportunities for U.S. services firms, which would not otherwise exist. For example, nearly 2/3 of all Mexican government employees are insured by a U.S. service supplier. U.S. firms also supply pensions and auto insurance directly to the Mexican government. And other major U.S. services firms in the financial services and IT sector have also benefited from procurement contracts under NAFTA. NAFTA's procurement chapter provides an important institutional framework of transparency and open bidding procedures for all three countries, and American services providers have taken full advantage. Briefly, I want to outline the principles that we think should govern the NAFTA modernization exercise. First, we must preserve the existing NAFTA framework, which provides a commercially stable and efficiently integrated environment for U.S. services suppliers, and make sure we do no harm to existing NAFTA benefits. Second, we must ensure that NAFTA is consistent with TPA requirements, and we strongly support the statement of the administration in its notification to Congress that it intended to do that in developing its negotiating objectives. And third, to preserve and enhance the benefits of NAFTA, it should remain a trilateral agreement with common rules across North America. And this integration of North American markets is fundamental to continuing to reap the benefits of NAFTA. Fourth, we must continue to ensure that U.S. firms can continue to perform and operate with commercial stability during the pendency of the NAFTA modernization negotiations. And then just very quickly, I realize my time is just about up. I wanted to highlight some negotiating objectives, and that is for services and investment market access. We see the continued use of a negative list and the ratchet as being critical. We think it is important that a modernized NAFTA should also be, as a starting point, it should meet or exceed the levels of market access agreed to in the Trans-Pacific Partnership and or those areas of liberalization adopted by Canada and Mexico since NAFTA. We also think that NAFTA should cover any new services that may emerge in the future, and that the United States must not accept carve-outs for new services. In the e-commerce area, we think it's critical that the provisions that the U.S. tabled in TISA with regard to e-commerce and financial services regarding data flows and data localization be included in a new agreement, and we think those provisions are critical. We also would like to see a streamlining and modernization of customs processes, such as use of electronic customs forms, electronic signature, and authentication. And we also want to see an upgraded de minimis level, which we think would benefit both large and small, particularly SME companies. For financial services, we would like to see equivalent coverage under investor state for financial services suppliers, and that would include the right to bring claims for national treatment and MFN under investor state. We also think that the agreement should address electronic payment services, an area that was not addressed in the original NAFTA, and we think it's very important that it be included, including a market access and national treatment obligation. We also think express delivery should be covered and in a modernized fashion so that inefficient processes that affect the ability to transport goods from the U.S. throughout the North American region is eliminated. And in Mexico, there are specific regulations that affect express delivery shipments, as well as the operation of foreign-owned trucks that need to be addressed. Similarly, in the area of trade facilitation, we think that there are customs facilitation provisions that need to be updated. We think the existing procurement provisions should be preserved. And on investment, we think the existing framework should be preserved along with expanded coverage under investor state for financial services. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
The next witness is Peter Matheson with the Securities Industry and Financial Markets Association. Mr. Matheson, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you for allowing me to testify for the Securities Industry and Financial Markets Association here today. SIFMA represents the broker-dealers, the banks, the asset managers, whose nearly 1 million employees provide access to the capital markets, raising over $2.5 trillion for businesses, municipalities here in the United States that serve clients with over $18.5 trillion in assets and managing more than $67 trillion in assets for individuals and institutional clients, including mutual funds and retirement plans. SIFMA strongly believes that financial services are crucial to the success of the overall United States economy. Ensuring trade agreements such as NAFTA are comprehensive and that they include financial services better enables our industry to support its clients in the manufacturing sector, the agriculture sector, and all other parts of the United States economy.
Peter, could you back off your mic just a tiny bit, please?
Is that better?
That's better.
There are several issues in the financial services sector that can be improved through the modernization of the North American Free Trade Agreement. Canada and Mexico are important export markets for American financial services firms. That is reflected strongly in trade surpluses in the sector with both the Canadian and Mexican economies. Reflecting what Christine just said, financial institutions from Canada and Mexico also make valuable contributions here in the United States. They do that through direct investments and through job creation. SIFMA therefore welcomes this opportunity to share the perspective of the financial services industry and our members in this important process. And specifically, SIFMA encourages the negotiators to improve upon the existing agreement by focusing on 4 key aspects. And it's those 4 key aspects that I would like to make the focus of my remaining opening remarks. Firstly, maintaining and expanding on the existing market access that the United States, Canadian, and Mexican financial services institutions enjoy in each other's economies. NAFTA modernization should not only codify existing levels of openness in the financial services industry, but should also seek to expand market access to benefit broader economic goals. Secondly, modernizing the agreement to address the rise of digital protectionism. Technology has obviously evolved very significantly since the original agreement in 1994, and the ability to transfer data across borders and to locate servers where needed, as well as to decide where and how to structure information technology infrastructure, is crucial for United States financial services firms operating today in a global environment. Thirdly, updating the agreement to improve financial regulatory coordination. Building on the Financial Services Committee established by the original NAFTA agreement, this modernization process presents us with an opportunity to enhance existing regulatory cooperation between the NAFTA economies, strengthening areas such as anti-money laundering, as well as helping us prevent unnecessarily regulatory divergences that risk hampering cross-border investment and the growth that it can drive. Fourthly and finally, enhancing investor protections in the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism. NAFTA should ensure that the financial sector has the same broad coverage of investor protections with investor-state dispute settlement as the enforcement mechanism that is afforded to all other sectors of the United States economy. So in conclusion, trade agreements represent valuable opportunities to grow the US economy. SIFMA very much wants to see a successful renegotiation of the NAFTA agreement. We believe recognizing the important issues at stake for US financial services firms in this process will help us achieve and allow the US economy overall to benefit more from a modernized agreement. Thank you for the attention on these important issues, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
The next witness is Stephen Simchak, the Director for International Affairs with the American Insurance Association. Mr. Simchak, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Chairman Gresser and members of the committee for having me here to allow me to talk with you all today about the modernization of NAFTA. AIA, the American Insurance Association, represents some of the most globally active non-life insurance companies. Our members have physical operations in over 70 countries around the world, and we serve customers in over 170 countries and territories. So negotiations like the modernization of NAFTA are of a significant importance to our membership. NAFTA has been vital to the growth of the U.S. insurance industry and our ability to serve policyholders in all three markets. As the three governments seek to modernize NAFTA, we believe that the core commitments that have been so beneficial must be preserved. However, NAFTA was written at a time when people still made calls from payphones, played cassette tapes in their cars, and making the football team was Stevie Simchak's biggest concern in life. So we must modernize the agreement in a way that best serves Americans while maintaining the parts of the agreement, like the benefits that insurers enjoy, that are working. Looking back at the impact that NAFTA has had, NAFTA insurance commitments created market access for U.S. insurers abroad and ensured fair treatment in those markets. Expanding upon the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement and applying binding international rules to Mexico, NAFTA significantly reduced barriers to trade and investment that U.S. insurers faced in those markets. Specifically, NAFTA eliminated Mexico's 30% foreign investment cap, which allowed U.S. insurance companies to own 100% of their locally established companies. And NAFTA ensured that U.S. insurance companies that did business in Mexico and Canada were to be treated fairly by those governments through national treatment and most favored nation commitments. Beyond the insurance-specific commitments, the economic growth in those foreign markets that NAFTA supports has created opportunities for U.S. insurers. NAFTA led to economic growth in all three markets, which in turn has generated opportunities for U.S. insurers to meet the expanded demand for insurance in those markets. When a country's economy grows, it means that there is more to insure in that market. More insurance coverage, in turn, supports more economic growth and economic stability. And much of the growth of the U.S. insurance industry that is related to NAFTA supports jobs at companies here in the United States. NAFTA creates jobs in the United States. Our members report to us that the growth in their companies that has been supported by their NAFTA-facilitated insurance exports has led to the creation of good-paying jobs. If a U.S. insurer does a lot of business in Mexico or Canada, jobs are created in the United States. These high-paying jobs are in fields such as analytics, finance, legal services, and underwriting. So, U.S. insurance trade also facilitates U.S. exports in other key sectors, and U.S. insurers have helped manufacturers and farmers sell their products in Mexico and in Canada. Furthermore, when a U.S. company exports services through commercial presence, they frequently look to the local office of a U.S. insurance group to cover them in new markets. However, as I stated in my introduction, there are areas of NAFTA that should be modernized to reflect the changes in the industry that have occurred since NAFTA was negotiated almost a quarter century ago. We have to remember that when NAFTA was negotiated, commitments on financial services trade were really in their infancy. It a little bit in the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement, but really this was one of the first big steps towards having binding, strong financial services commitments. We hope that the improvements that have happened since NAFTA was negotiated in free trade agreements, insurance trade commitments, will be reflected in a modernized NAFTA to ensure that it continue to support growth in our industry for decades to come. Modernizing NAFTA will maximize the benefits the original agreement has created. So just to outline a couple of our priorities for the modernization, we believe that NAFTA should strengthen and expand commitments on cross-border insurance trade for large corporate customers. NAFTA should improve commitments on nationality of boards of directors. NAFTA should protect data flows for insurers. NAFTA should limit the anti-competitive advantages owned by state-owned insurers. It should also limit the use of investment screens and remove other barriers to commercial presence. And we also believe that all existing commitments must be rigorously implemented prior to the conclusion of a new modernized agreement. Finally, once completed, a modernized NAFTA must be enforced, including for services and financial services. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify here today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
The next witness is Gustavo Papamayo with the TV Association of Programmers Latin America. Mr. Papamayo, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning. The Television Association of Programmers...
Can you pull your mic a little closer, please? Thank you.
The Television Association of Programmers Latin America appreciates the opportunity to provide testimony to the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative on negotiating objectives regarding the modernization of the North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada and Mexico. TAP is an industry trade association representing more than 100 international pay TV channels from 8 major media companies. A&E Networks, Sony, Olay Communications, AMC Networks International Latin America, Discovery Communications, Fox Networks Group Latin America, NBC, Universal, Telemundo International, Turner Latin America, ESPN, the Walt Disney Company, and Viacom International Media Networks, the Americas. As an industry, we are firm believers that the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, should be maintained but strengthened because its current provisions have fallen short of fully and adequately protecting the interest of the U.S. pay television programmers in Mexico, represented by TAP. Nonetheless, we believe that 4 basic principles of the current accord should be maintained in any new version. These are Article 1102, national treatment, Article 1105, minimum standard of treatment, Article 1108, reservations and exceptions, a ratchet clause or principle according to which once a country has liberalized a particular service or sector of its economy, it cannot make changes to its legal regime that imply a retreat from that liberalization. And Article 1110, expropriating compensation, which prohibits direct and indirect expropriations without compensation. Notwithstanding these 4 principles, the current NAFTA treaty has been unable to address discriminatory measures included in Mexico's 2014 Federal Telecommunications and Broadcasting Law, which failed to fully guarantee fair treatment for U.S. pay TV companies despite the referenced legal background. In Mexico, the pay TV market, in which federal law allows 100% foreign investment, and which is the primary and probably the only outlet for foreign programmers, continues to be subjected to more stringent advertising restrictions than free-to-air broadcast television, where only 49% foreign investment is permitted and is primarily supplied by domestic operators. U.S. programmers exporting intellectual property to Mexico are heavily dependent on advertising for their operating revenues and return on investments. Article 237 of Mexico's telecommunications reform imposes a limitation over the foreign programmers' commercial rights by limiting the number of advertisement minutes to be broadcast per hour, while allowing all other media platforms to insert advertisement on a daily percentage basis. What this means is this structure yields up to twice as much advertising time for domestic broadcast television, with 2 national broadcasting companies controlling about 90% of the national broadcast market. Mexico's legal framework of television advertising is subject to the NAFTA prohibition of discrimination against U.S. investors. However, the government of Mexico explicitly issues provisions that artificially shifts large amounts of advertising revenues from U.S. investments to Mexican investments. Mexico's actions in this matter is indisputably in violation of NAFTA's most fundamental principle of national interest, of national treatment, among others. On behalf of TAP, we ask your support. We thank you for the opportunity to testify at this public hearing, and I welcome your questions. Thank you.
The final witness on this panel is Amgad Shihada, Senior Vice President with the Global Borders Policy, UPS. Mr. Shihada, you have 5 minutes.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to testify regarding this modernization of NAFTA. UPS strongly supports this effort and is eager to assist where possible by leveraging our unique perspective as an express delivery services provider and a global supply chain integrator. Today in our delivery trucks, trailers, planes, and sea containers, we move approximately 3% of global GDP and 6% of U.S. GDP across 290 120 countries. Trade benefits our company, our workers, and our customers. We estimate that every 22 packages that cross a border support or create a job in the UPS network. We view NAFTA modernization as an opportunity to strengthen business competitiveness and fuel U.S. export growth. E-commerce, in particular, is a growing phenomenon that should play a considerable role in informing the future blueprint for North American commercial engagement and customs protocol. For the last 6 years, e-commerce in the U.S. has consistently grown above 14% annually, meaning that American businesses, particularly as SMEs, have much to gain from facilitating the movement of goods to our two largest commercial partners. A seamless end-to-end buyer experience is critical when it comes to cross-border e-commerce. The e-commerce ecosystem, which includes the search engines, the retail websites, the online marketplaces for entrepreneurs, the financial services providers, and the express delivery companies, depend heavily on rules and regulations that foster harmonious operation between all these facilitative elements. With this picture in mind, UPS offers the following logistics recommendations, which fall into 3 categories: market access, customs modernization, and security. Firstly, market access. While NAFTA opened up trade lanes between the 3 countries, restrictions, particularly by Mexico, are impacting UPS's ability to bring American goods to consumers beyond the border. These restrictions add barriers and unnecessary complications and cost to the import-export process for our customers. For example, Mexico's domestic express delivery regulations impose excessively restrictive definitions on the size of packages and the size of delivery vehicles used to carry out delivery operations. The administration should compel Mexico to lift entirely, or at minimum, raise the defined weight of an express shipment to the internationally recognized 70 kilos. Such restrictive definitions impact cross-border efficiencies and hinder the growth of U.S. exports. Today's integrated North American supply chains have inputs and components zigzagging across borders many times in order to create the final product. Customers therefore rely heavily on less than truckload, or LTL, and express delivery shipments. Both the LTL and express shipment environments blossomed over the last 20 years because of how NAFTA boosted regional supply chain integration. But legislative and regulatory processes have not caught up to the realities that we see on the ground today. The U.S.-Mexico process for crossing the border is antiquated and unnecessarily inefficient. The U.S. needs to insist that Mexico revamp border policies and regulations that continue to add significant cost and administrative burdens for U.S. companies wishing to export. More details contained within our FRN submission. Next, customs modernization. Regulatory coherence is the cornerstone of an efficient North American supply chain. The foundation for all harmonized regulation is the use of electronic platforms for import-export processing. Both the WTO's TFA and the revised Kyoto Convention of the WCO have a blueprint for such. 3 key areas are pre-arrival processing of shipment data, effective risk management techniques, and smarter border processes that separate the release of shipments from customs. The administration should leverage these agreements to compel Mexico in particular to adhere to these agreements. Also, reporting and compliance processes for NAFTA qualified goods are outdated. The new process established within the latest U.S. free trade agreements should serve as a basis for the development of a modern, paperless, digitally enabled NAFTA qualification program. Lastly, in March 2016, the U.S. succeeded in raising its de minimis threshold from $200 to $800, the threshold under which goods enter the United States duty and tax-free. The administration should hold our neighbors to reciprocal treatment while also pressing for parity with state-owned enterprise. And finally, the last category, security. Given the United States' vast land border, ensuring secure and safe trade should be a top NAFTA modernization priority. The 3 countries' trusted trader programs America's CT-PAT, Canada's PIP, and Mexico's AEO trusted programs were designed individually. Harmonizing these programs is key to ensuring a secure North American environment. In conclusion, we believe the measures I described above contribute to a larger competitiveness strategy that is comprehensive to drive and fuel American exports, enhance business prospects, and valuable employment opportunities. We are service providers that move goods of all value from all sectors to all points in the North American neighborhood. We're committed to attaining a 21st century NAFTA that reduces the time, cost, and complexity of trade. Simply put, when it's easier to trade, more trade happens. UPS hopes the administration considers these recommendations as it formulates its blueprint. We commend the administration for its focus for updating this critical agreement, and thank you for the opportunity to provide input into the process.
Mr. Chairman, that concludes direct testimony from this panel.
Thank you all. We have a few minutes remaining for questions, so let me start it off by asking Ms. Bliss a question. More in your written submission than your oral commentary today, you talked about a structure of agreement, including a chapter on digital trade in the revised NAFTA. Could you outline a little bit on the structural side of things, what you think would be important to include in such a chapter?
Yes, and thanks very much for asking that question, because it's a very important priority for CSI member companies. First and foremost, what we want to see, based on what was included in what the U.S. tabled in the TISA negotiations, which was built on what was negotiated in TPP, are clear and enforceable rules providing for free cross-border flow of data and prohibiting forced data localization for all services, including financial services. And just to be clear there, what I'm talking about is both the specific provision on transfer of data that is already provided in financial services, the addition of a cross-border flow of data provision in the e-commerce chapter, as was done in TPP and then tabled in TISA. And then with respect to prohibition of forced data localization, a provision that applied to non-financial services in TPP in the e-commerce chapter, and then a specific proposal that was tabled by the administration in TISA with respect to financial services for the financial services chapter. And then there are a series of other provisions that were included along the lines of prohibition on customs duties on electronic transmissions and on the value of data being transmitted, streamlining and modernizing customs processes, such as the use of electronic customs forms, electronic signatures and authentication, and secure online payment, in addition to upgraded de minimis levels, and also a prohibition on parties from creating market access barriers by imposing restrictions on security technologies used to safeguard against intrusions, including the requirement to transfer private keys for products that use cryptography, and also prohibition on parties from requiring the transfer of or access to their technology, including software source code, as a condition for allowing the provision of a service. I know our time is limited, so I would say that those are the key elements with respect to electronic commerce, both for services and financial services. With respect to telecommunications in the separate telecom chapter, we would like to see updated provisions to ensure market access and a pro-competition, pro-investment environment, and avoidance of barriers such as limitations on technology choice or disproportionately burdensome regulatory requirements. We also think it's important that foreign service suppliers are allowed to rely on global technology standards that are developed through voluntary industry-led processes. And we also think a modernized NAFTA should include provisions to address intermediary liability safe harbors relating to third-party content and for matters other than intellectual property and criminal law, consistent with U.S. law, which we would see being dealt with separately in intellectual property chapter. Thank you.
Could I turn to Paul Thanos, who's joining us from the Commerce Department today for a question?
Thank you, John. Mr. Simchak, you stated in your submission that trade agreement commitments on state-owned enterprises and you stated in your submission that trade agreement commitments on state-owned enterprises and sectoral commitments on post offices are not significant issues with Canada or Mexico, but you nonetheless would like to see them included in NAFTA. Could you please explain why it's important for these rules to be included, given the lack of country-specific concerns with respect to Canada and Mexico?
Certainly, and thank you very much. That's an excellent question. I think the reason we want to see these commitments in NAFTA is that political wins so frequently change more rapidly than trade wins. Right now, we don't see any issue in Canada or Mexico with post offices that sell or underwrite insurance, or more broadly speaking, with state-owned insurers. But that's the status today. That's the situation today. We don't know in 5 years whether or not that will be an issue in either market. And I think that this is probably going to be the only bite at the apple we get for the modernization of NAFTA for some time. So we would like to see those commitments included in the in NAFTA to rein in the advantages that state-owned enterprises, including post offices that sell and underwrite insurance, include. This is a huge problem around the world. As some of you may know from experiences in other trade negotiations, one of the largest and sometimes calculated as the largest insurance companies in the world is Japan's post office. I love the U.S. Postal Service, but I don't want to go there to buy insurance. Yet, Japan's post office is one of the largest insurance companies in the world. They got that status not because they offer superior customer service or better products, but because they enjoyed advantages from their owner, which is also their government and their regulator, for many, many years. That significantly distorted the insurance market in Japan, and now the situation has begun to change in Japan through a lot of pressure, with great thanks to the U.S. government. But when these sorts of state-owned insurers pop up, it distorts the market in such a significant way that I think it's important to have these commitments in NAFTA, and that would make NAFTA a standard-setting agreement for the future, for future trade agreements, which I think is also important. And then finally, I would just say that since these agreements were included in the TPP negotiations, and both Canada and Mexico took on these commitments in the TPP negotiations, we would hope that these would be familiar to them and that it would not be as difficult a process to negotiate these into the modernized NAFTA as, say, introducing new types of commitments. Thank you.
Could I turn to Sarah Senich from the Treasury Department for a question?
Yes, thank you, and thank you to all the panelists for being here today. We very much appreciate your testimony and your submissions. I would like to ask Mr. Matheson, in your submission, you noted the need to expand market access commitments and limit exceptions for the financial services sector. In your view specifically, what expanded market access commitments could be sought and what specific exceptions should be narrowed or eliminated? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, like other organizations here, I mean, SIFMA is obviously a member-driven association, and obviously the TPP agreement compared to NAFTA had done a reasonably good job, I think, of updating many of those exceptions. But we're presently with our members really still in the process of evaluating those and wondering and taking a look at those in the context of the business that our members do in Canada, Mexico, to really take a view on what should be the priority there. So I think we're kind of really still in the process of evaluating and thinking about that, but we should have something probably more specific soon.
And we have Amy Holman here from the State Department. Amy, could you ask a question?
Sure. Thanks, John. And thanks to all of our witnesses for coming in today and sharing their insights and views with us this morning. My question is for Mr. Shahada. You note there are a number of challenges with respect to doing business in Mexico, such as the 3-vehicle process of moving U.S. goods into Mexico and proposed regulations that would alter standing practices related to the de minimis for low-value shipments. Given that some of these barriers appear to affect disproportionately smaller shippers, has UPS identified the financial costs of these existing and proposed regulations, either as a percentage of the cost of a shipment or on some larger scale? Thank you.
So in separating, to answer your question, in separating the treatment at the border versus the treatment inland in Mexico, I would tell you we have a better pulse on the border issues than the inland issues. Anecdotally, the market on
Can you please get a little closer to your mic? Thank you.
the cross-border market in Canada and the United States to cross that border versus the cost of crossing the Mexico-U.S. border. The market rates for brokerage and facilitation and transportation on the northern border are approximately $30 per transaction. Where on the Mexico-U.S. border, it's approximately $200 per transaction. And the reason for that is this 3-truck issue, the issues in regards to the facilitation, the deconsolidation and reconsolidation. All those issues drive costs that are then borne by the shipper in the United States. So to specifically answer your question, there's an economic burden on the southern border in regards to how that is transported versus the Canada-U.S. border.
Thank you.
I'll ask Ed Gresser to ask a question.
Thank you. This is for Ms. Bliss. Your organization's response to the Federal Register notice recommends the U.S. should preserve existing NAFTA market access in the context of the NAFTA renegotiation. In particular, do you feel the coverage of professional services generally or with respect to chapters like government procurement is satisfactory for your member companies?
I think by and large we do, and it's really based on our overall concern for the preservation of existing benefits under the agreement and our concern that those benefits not be undermined. So you mentioned procurement in particular. Our priority in that area really is to preserve existing benefits because they are so immense. As I mentioned, a U.S. services firm is currently insuring about 2/3 of existing Mexican civil servants. And they're also providing pension, another company is providing pensions to those employees. Another is providing auto insurance to the government. We have 2 IT firms that are very active in, well, 3 actually that are very active in the Mexican market, 2 benefiting from procurement provisions. We have other financial services companies that have also benefited tremendously. So I think the concern is very much weighted in the direction of preserving existing provisions. We recognize that there can be improvements with respect to the transparency of those provisions and also the due process and fair processes that are provided under them because they haven't been touched for over 2 decades. But by and large, our focus would be on existing access, preserving that.
Let me turn again to Paul Thanos for a question.
Mr. Pupumayo. Since free-to-air broadcasting is funded from advertising revenue and the free availability of such broadcasting provides a social benefit, some advocate that free-to-air broadcasting should be entitled to more time for advertising. Do you agree with this rationale? And absent government regulation, is there evidence that market forces could address this issue? Meaning, would consumers simply gravitate away from programming with more advertising?
Thank you for your question. It's an outmoded model. In 20 years ago, you would get mostly your free-to-air with an antenna. But today, in countries like Mexico, over 50% of the viewers pay to receive their content through satellite and through cable systems. Since that has changed, you end up with an uneven playing field because you have the local broadcasters allowed up to 4 times as much commercial time as the foreign content providers utilizing the same distribution services. When you add to that, the gatekeepers are primarily local preponderant operators, you create a situation that is clearly at a disadvantage for foreign content providers. Furthermore, there has been very little enforcement of the fundamentals of NAFTA that should have protected our industry. But in the end, to answer your question very briefly, it's a matter that technology has changed the playing field, and we're now subject to the same competition or the same vehicle of distribution for both the over-the-air and the pay TV.
Thank you. That concludes the time available for this panel, so I thank you again for participating both in your written comments and your statements and answers to our questions today. We are in the midst of our review of the NAFTA as we prepare for a renegotiation, so I am sure we will continue to be in touch with you and other stakeholders as that proceeds. And again, thanks for making the effort to provide us with your advice.